Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight's theme is roommate stories. The people who seem perfectly normal in the 30-minute apartment showing and revealed their full reality approximately 6 days after move-in. Get comfortable, turn the lights down, and let's get into it. First up, someone who moved in with a stranger, spent 4 months being gaslit about their own belongings, and solved the whole thing with a piece of tape and a marker. I found the listing on a housing app in August. The apartment was a 2-bedroom in a neighborhood I'd been trying to get into for 2 years, and the price was reasonable for the area because the person posting the listing, a woman named Greta, had been there for 3 years and was grandfathered into a rent that the current market had long since surpassed. She needed someone to split utilities and take the second bedroom. I needed an apartment. The 30-minute walkthrough went well. She seemed organized. The common areas were clean. The refrigerator was not a disaster. I signed a sublease and moved in on a Saturday. The first 2 weeks were fine in the way that first weeks often are when both parties are still on their best behavior, without being fully conscious of the performance. We were polite in the kitchen. We left notes about utility bills that were friendly in tone. The bathroom schedule worked itself out organically. I told a friend on the phone that I thought I had gotten lucky with the roommate situation, which I now understand as a statement made directly into the void. Week 3 was when things started. I had a specific brand of coffee that I bought in whole bean form and ground myself in the morning, which was a habit I had maintained for years and which, I want to be clear, I kept in my bedroom rather than the common kitchen, precisely because I understood that communal kitchen items become communal kitchen items. The coffee was in my room. It was in a sealed container. It was in my room. I noticed the container was lighter. Not dramatically lighter, lighter in the way you notice when something you interact with daily has shifted incrementally. I told myself I had miscounted how much was in it. I bought more. 2 weeks later, the same thing happened. I began keeping a rough mental accounting of where the container was in its cycle, and the accounting did not match what I found when I checked. I bought a small kitchen scale. I started weighing the container every morning before I left for work and logging the weight in a note on my phone. By the end of the first week of weighing, I had established that approximately 30 grams of coffee were disappearing between the time I left for work and the time I returned. On days when Greta worked from home, I did not confront Greta immediately because I wanted to be certain, and because I am someone who prefers to arrive at a difficult conversation already holding the accurate version of events rather than a suspicion. I waited another week. The 30 grams continued to disappear. I had a pattern and a log and a reasonable certainty. I brought it up over dinner one evening. I cooked, she was in the kitchen. The conversation happened in the way that conversations happen when two people are already in the same space, and one of them has something to say. I told her I had noticed my coffee was going down faster than I was using it, and I asked her directly whether she had been using it. She looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as performatively confused, and said she had her own coffee, gesturing to a bag on the counter, and that she had no idea what I was talking about. I said I had been weighing the container. She said that was an unusual thing to do. I said I had started doing it specifically because I had noticed the discrepancy, and that the log on my phone showed 30 grams, disappearing on weekdays when she was home and I was not. She said the scale must be inaccurate. I said it was a kitchen scale I had purchased for this purpose and had tested against a known weight before using. She maintained with impressive commitment that she had not touched my coffee. She said it with the specific quality of someone who has decided that a sufficiently consistent denial is indistinguishable from the truth if delivered without flinching. I said I believed the scale. She said she believed herself. We ate the rest of the dinner without resolving anything. The following morning, I put a small piece of masking tape across the lid of the coffee container and marked it with a marker at the seam. Not visible unless you knew to look, but completely visible once the lid had been removed and replaced. I left for work. When I returned, the tape was slightly misaligned. Not dramatically, just enough. I took a photograph, and I did not say anything to Greta that evening. I continued logging. The tape was disturbed approximately every other workday for the following 2 weeks. I had a log, a photograph, and a pattern. I sent Greta a message rather than having the conversation in person. I told her I had the tape evidence and the photographs and the weight log, and that I was not interested in a continued denial, because the documentation was specific enough that the denial was no longer a viable position. I told her I was not going to ask her to leave or make the living situation uncomfortable, but I needed her to acknowledge what had been happening, and I needed it to stop. I also needed her to replace the coffee she had used, which at 30 grams a day across approximately 6 weeks, amounted to about 400 grams of a specific whole bean. I listed by name. She sent back a message that was 3 sentences long. The first said she guessed she had used some of my coffee without thinking about it. The second said she was sorry. The third asked if I could get the same brand because she had come to prefer it to her own. I bought a small lock for my bedroom door, not for the coffee specifically, for the general principle of things. The remaining 5 months of the lease passed without further incident, or without further incident that I could document, which is a different statement and one I make deliberately. Greta and I maintained a civil coexistence that neither of us attempted to deepen into something warmer. When the lease ended, I moved out on a Saturday with the specific feeling of someone finishing a chapter. They are glad to be done with and glad to have survived. The coffee I used during those final 5 months, I will count as the most deliberately savored coffee of my adult life. 30 grams a day, weighed, logged, and entirely mine. Right? The tape on the lid is the move that makes this whole story, because it converts a situation where one person is certain and the other is simply better at lying into a situation where the lie no longer has anywhere to go. The specificity of the documentation, the log, the weight, the photographs, is what earns the ending message that drops the denial in 3 sentences and then somehow asks for more coffee. That last request is the detail that tells you everything you need to know about Greta, as a roommate and as a person. She was caught, she apologized, and in the same breath, she tried to turn the thing she had been stealing into a preference she would like to continue receiving. There are people in the world who can do that without apparent awareness of how it reads, and they are almost always the exact kind of person you find in a housing app listing that seems too good to be true. This next one comes from someone who lived with a person for 8 months and only understood, after they moved out, that they had been the subject of a long and extraordinarily patient social experiment. My roommate's name was Philip, and he was on the surface an ideal roommate. He was quiet. He cleaned up after himself in the kitchen with the kind of thoroughness that made me slightly self-conscious about my own habits. He paid his half of everything on the day it was due, sometimes before. He did not have loud guests. He did not play music at hours that affected my sleep. He observed the ordinary courtesies of shared space without needing them to be negotiated, which I had learned from previous living situations was far rarer than it should have been. We were not close. Friendly and easy surface way of 2 people who share a kitchen and a television and a general goodwill, without needing to be friends specifically. He had his life and I had mine, and the apartment was the place both of us came back to at the end of the day, and the arrangement worked with the efficiency of something that had found its natural shape. The thing I began to notice in month 3 was subtle enough that I dismissed it for longer than I should have. Philip was interested in my schedule in a way that exceeded the ordinary calibration of shared space logistics. He asked questions about where I was going with a frequency that could have been friendly curiosity, and that across enough instances began to feel like something more systematic. He noted when I returned later than expected in a way that suggested the expectation had been tracked. He once mentioned, casually, that he had tried a restaurant I had gone to and had found it disappointing, which would have been an ordinary observation if I had told him I was going to that restaurant, which I had not. I did not say anything about this for two reasons. The first was that each individual instance was dismissible, and I did not want to make the living situation uncomfortable over something I could not be certain about. The second was that I was trying to understand what I was observing before I reacted to it, which is generally my approach to uncertain situations. Month 5 produced the clearest instance. I had made plans to visit a friend in another city for a long weekend. I had mentioned this in passing to Philip as context for my absence, without specifying which city or which friend. I returned on a Sunday evening, and Philip, who was in the kitchen, said he hoped the trip to Marcy's had been good. Marcy was my friend. I had not mentioned Marcy's name to Philip at any point. I was certain of this in the specific way of someone who had learned to pay attention. So I said something non-committal and went to my room and sat on my bed and thought about the name. Then I opened my laptop and I looked at my various accounts and apps with the question in mind of where Philip could have encountered Marcy's name in a way that was connected to my plans. My calendar. I shared a digital calendar with my family for coordination purposes, and the permissions on that calendar were wider than I had realized. It was technically visible to anyone I had shared it with, which included, I discovered when I looked at the sharing settings, Philip, who I had shared it with in month 1, to coordinate a single shared appointment and whose access I had not subsequently revoked. My calendar had Marcy's name on it. Philip had looked at my calendar. I revoked the access immediately. Then I sat with the larger question of what the access had been used for and for how long, which I could not answer with certainty, but which the instances I had noticed suggested was ongoing rather than occasional. I did not confront Philip directly. What I did was change the nature of my calendar entries going forward. I made them deliberately vague, using initials and locations and times that were technically accurate and specifically uninformative. I also began noting, in a separate private document, each instance where Philip's knowledge of my schedule seemed to exceed what I had told him. Over the following 3 months, the instances became less frequent, which I interpreted as Philip noticing that the calendar had become less useful and adjusting accordingly. And I moved out when the lease ended in a way that was completely ordinary and without drama. Philip gave me a warm goodbye. I gave him a warm goodbye. The warmth was entirely sincere, from a person who had concluded they were dealing with something unusual, and who had decided the best response to the unusual thing was to change the information environment until the lease ended. 6 months after moving out, I got a text from Philip asking how I was. I said I was well. He asked if I was still in touch with Marcy. I said yes. He did not ask how he knew about Marcy. I did not remind him. There it is. Philip knowing Marcy's name from the calendar is a specific moment where the systematic quality of his interest becomes undeniable. Not suspicious behavior, just one name he should not have known. Dog delivered casually in a kitchen on a Sunday evening. The response of adjusting the information environment rather than confronting is the move that most people in this situation would not think of. And it is exactly right. You cannot win a direct confrontation with someone who has been patient enough to build a monitoring system over 5 months. But you can make the monitoring system yield less useful results until the lease runs out. Philip texting 6 months later to ask about Marcy is the coda that confirms the whole reading, delivered from a safe distance in a way that has nowhere to go. Some people are intensely curious about the people they live with and never fully understand why that curiosity makes those people want to move. Here's one from someone whose roommate situation lasted 14 months and ended with a deduction so specific and so petty that it became something close to a legend among everyone who heard it. The roommate's name was Soren. The apartment was in a city neither of us was originally from, which meant we had found each other through a roommate matching service rather than through any prior social connection, which meant the entire architecture of our cohabitation was built on a 30-minute phone call and the mutual assessment that neither of us seemed immediately alarming. Soren had rules, not rules he announced. Rules he maintained through behavior and through a specific variety of pointed silence that communicated displeasure with precision and without directness. The bathroom counter was Soren's domain, and anything placed on it outside its designated area was quietly returned to you in the form of finding it on your bed when you came home. The recycling had a system that was more elaborate than any recycling system I had previously encountered, and whose logic became clear to me only after 3 weeks of violation and correction. The windows were to be closed before noon in summer, to keep the heat out, which was a rule I agreed with in principle and failed to remember in practice, which Soren tracked by placing his hand on the glass when he came home, to assess the ambient temperature and then looking at me with an expression that communicated findings without words. None of this was catastrophic. When difficult people exist, and I'm not without my own particular requirements, and the 14 months pass with a level of functional cohabitation that I would not describe as warm, but would not describe as broken. We lived around each other with the specific efficiency of two people who have mutually assessed the situation and concluded that the lowest friction path is to communicate as little as possible while meeting all shared obligations precisely. The deduction happened when we moved out. We had paid a security deposit at the start of the lease, a standard amount, split evenly, held by the landlord. The apartment was in good shape when we left. I knew this because I had cleaned my portion of it with the thoroughness of someone who has previously lost a security deposit and has not forgotten the experience. And we received the deposit back in full, which the landlord sent as a single check made out to both of us. Soren proposed we split the check evenly, and I agreed. He said he would handle the transaction, and I gave him my bank details. A few days later, I received a transfer that was not half of the check. It was less than half of the check by a specific amount that I recognized immediately. It was exactly the value of 1 tube of toothpaste. I looked at the transfer amount for a long time. Then I sent Soren a message, asking about the discrepancy. He responded with a photograph. The photograph was of a tube of toothpaste. His toothpaste, a brand I recognized, photographed in a context that suggested it was nearly empty. Beneath the photograph, he had written a note explaining that, in month 4, he had seen me use his toothpaste on one occasion, and had not said anything at the time, but had made a note of it and was deducting the cost from the deposit split at the conclusion of our tenancy. Month 4. He had been carrying the toothpaste note for 10 months. I sent him back the cost of a full tube of his toothpaste brand, plus the amount of toothpaste I had actually used, proportionally calculated, rounded up to the nearest cent, and told him I had rounded up in his favor and considered the matter closed. I want to be honest that the rounding up was a deliberate choice. I wanted the final message of the transaction to be that I had paid more than was owed rather than less, which felt like the correct punctuation for 14 months of Soren. He accepted the transfer without comment. We have not spoken since. Somewhere in a city I no longer live in, Soren is tracking something about someone, patiently, waiting for the right moment to account for it. I genuinely respect the commitment, even as I remain glad it is no longer my life. That's where that one lands. The 10-month toothpaste note is the detail that defines Soren more completely than anything else in the story. Not the recycling system, not the window temperature assessments, but the decision in month 4 to photograph evidence of a single toothpaste usage and carry it forward through the entire remaining arc of the lease to be settled at the mathematically precise moment of separation. The narrator's response, paying slightly more than was owed as deliberate punctuation, is the exactly right move, the one that refuses to engage with the pettiness on its own terms, while also declining to absorb it silently. Some people keep score across timescales, that other people would consider disproportionate, and the only correct response at the end of 14 months is to pay the toothpaste debt with interest and move on. Last one for tonight, someone who lived with two roommates instead of one, and discovered that the two against one dynamic had been the operating structure of the apartment before they ever arrived. I moved into a 3-bedroom apartment with two people who already knew each other, a woman named Danny and a man named Cole, who had been friends since college and who had lived together once before, in a different city, before both of them ended up in the same place and decided to find a third person to split the rent. The listing described them as easygoing, which in my experience is a word used exclusively by people who have a specific definition of easy that does not match the standard one. The first month was the month of being welcomed. They included me in dinners. They asked about my life with what appeared to be genuine interest. They had a group chat for the apartment and added me to it with a message that had exclamation points in it. I believed I had found the roommate situation I had been hoping for. People who would be friendly without being intrusive, connected without requiring my participation in all connection. Month 2 was when I began to understand the structure. Danny and Cole had a history that expressed itself in the apartment as a kind of ambient alliance, not hostile to me, not explicitly excluding, but structured in a way that made my position in household permanent third, regardless of what I contributed. Decisions about the apartment were made between them and presented to me afterward. The group chat was primarily between them, with me as recipient. When something needed to be addressed, a maintenance request, a conversation with the landlord, a decision about a shared item, the addressing happened on their timeline in a way that felt efficient and also felt like something I had not been given the option to participate in. I tried to raise this in the 3rd month, in the way that people try to raise things when they are not certain they are reading the situation correctly and do not want to appear paranoid. I mentioned in the group chat that I would like to be included in apartment decisions before they were finalized. Danny responded warmly that, of course, I should be, and she was sorry if it had seemed otherwise. Cole said same, absolutely. The next apartment decision was made between the two of them, and texted to me after. Month 6 was the one that produced the clearest picture. A situation arose with a neighbor below us who was complaining about noise, a complaint that I did not think was directed primarily at me, given that my section of the apartment was the farthest from the noise in question. Danny and Cole had a conversation with the neighbor that I was not part of. Then they had a conversation with each other about what to address. Then they came to me together, both of them in my doorway, and standing in a way that occupied the doorway, with the specific geometry of people who have coordinated their positioning, and told me that the neighbor had specifically mentioned my bedroom area as the source of the noise. I knew this was not true, because I had spoken to the neighbor myself in the hallway 2 days earlier, and the neighbor had not mentioned my area at all. I said this. Danny and Cole exchanged a glance that was designed not to be noticed, and was noticed. Then Danny said the neighbor might not have wanted to say it directly to me, and had said it to them instead. I said that was a possible explanation, and also possible was that the noise was not coming from my area, and the neighbor had said something different than what they were reporting. The specific quality of the silence that followed that statement was the silence of two people who had told a story and been told cleanly and without drama that the story did not match another available account. I did not make it a confrontation. I said I would be careful about noise and thanked them for letting me know, and closed my door and sat with what had just happened. The picture that assembled was one I had been seeing in pieces for 6 months and now had enough of to call complete. Two people who were friends first and roommates second, for whom the apartment was a shared space, primarily belonging to their friendship and secondarily occupied by a third party whose presence was useful and whose participation in the household's operation was limited to the parts that were convenient. I found a new apartment when the lease came up. I did not tell them I was leaving until the required notice period, and I did not offer an explanation beyond the standard one about having found something that worked better for my situation. They were surprised in a way that seemed genuine, which was its own piece of information about how clearly they had been seeing the dynamic from their side of it. The new apartment was a single, which cost more per month than my share of the 3-bedroom. I have not once regretted the difference. And that's where we'll leave things for tonight. The doorway geometry is the image I keep returning to in that story. Two people who have coordinated their physical positioning to present a unified front in your own doorway, in your own home, but over a noise complaint they have quietly adjusted in the retelling. That detail is not something you plan consciously. It is what happens when two people who are aligned in an apartment are also, without deciding to be, aligned against the third person in it. The narrator clocking the glance and not letting the story pass unchallenged is the move that matters. Not a confrontation, not a scene, just the quiet introduction of an alternative account that the two of them cannot address without acknowledging they had a version. And she had a different one. Sometimes the most important thing you can do in a living situation that is working against you is simply refuse to absorb a story that doesn't match what you know, state that clearly once, and then close your door. This one is from someone who spent 10 months living with a person who was, by all external measures, completely normal, and who was running one of the more elaborate passive-aggressive campaigns anyone in tonight's collection had to navigate. My roommate's name was Bet, and she came with excellent references. I say this not sarcastically. I had actually called her previous roommate, which is something I had started doing after a bad experience 2 apartments prior, and the previous roommate had said Bet was reliable and clean and respectful of shared space. All of those things were true. She was also, I would discover, someone who had developed passive aggression into something approaching a discipline. Not the ordinary kind. The ordinary kind is detectable within the first month and can be addressed, or at least named. Bet's variety was sophisticated enough that I spent 3 months unable to confirm that what I was experiencing was intentional, rather than a series of unfortunate coincidences. The coincidences were never unfortunate in directions that affected Bet. They were exclusively unfortunate in directions that affected me. This is the thing I should have clocked earlier than I did. When the pattern of inconvenience is perfectly consistent in its targeting, the word coincidence eventually runs out of usefulness. The first instance was the hot water. Our apartment had a water heater that took time to recover between showers, which was a known quantity and one we had discussed. I showered in the mornings, Bet showered in the evenings. The timing was designed to avoid overlap. In month 2, the timing shifted without announcement. Bet began showering in the mornings. Not every morning, 2 or 3 times a week, at times that were 20 minutes before my usual shower, which meant I was consistently arriving at a shower that had not fully recovered. When I mentioned this, she said she had been getting up earlier for work and hadn't thought about the timing. She adjusted back to evenings. 3 weeks later, the morning showers resumed at the same interval. This pattern repeated itself 4 times across the 10 months. Each time I mentioned it, she adjusted. Each time the adjustment held for 3 weeks before the pattern resumed. The precision of the 3-week interval was something I noticed only in retrospect. The second instance involved the thermostat, which was into the common hallway and accessible to both of us. Our apartment building had a heating system that ran on a timer, meaning the thermostat setting at night determined the temperature trajectory for the following morning. Bet controlled the thermostat more often than I did, because her bedroom was closer to it. I began noticing in the colder months that mornings were consistently colder than my preferred temperature. I would adjust the thermostat in the evening and arrive the following morning to find it back where Bet had set it. She said she slept better in a cooler apartment. I said I woke up cold. We agreed on a compromise temperature. The compromise temperature held for 10 days, and then her preferred temperature returned. This too had a cycle, adjustment 3 weeks, on return. And I was now aware of the 3-week cycle from the shower situation, and I understood I was watching a pattern rather than a series of resolutions that happened to fail. The third instance was the one that made everything legible in a single moment. I had been waiting for a package, a reasonably important one. Equipment for a home project I had been planning for several weeks. The building had a buzzer system, and packages too large for the mailbox required someone to be home to buzz the delivery person in. Bet worked from home 3 days a week. I had mentioned the package to her, casually, in the way of sharing relevant household information, and she had said she would buzz them in if she was home when it arrived. The package required 2 delivery attempts. Both attempts occurred on days when Bet was working from home. Both times the delivery person left a notice because nobody answered the buzzer. Both times Bet said she had not heard it. The buzzer was directly outside her home office door. It was not, to my knowledge, a quiet buzzer. I picked up the package from the depot on a Saturday, carrying it 2.5 miles because I did not own a car, and I set it down in the apartment hallway, and I sat in my room for a while, thinking about the shower and the thermostat and the buzzer and the 3-week intervals, and I understood that I had been living with someone who was operating on a schedule of minor inconveniences that were individually deniable and collectively deliberate. I did not know what I had done to produce this. I have spent some time since trying to identify it, and I have not been able to. My best theory is that Bet had expected to live alone and had decided at some point before or shortly after I moved in that she preferred living alone, and had concluded that making my experience of the apartment slightly worse on a rotating basis was preferable to having an actual conversation about it. I did not confront her. I decided after the package situation that the confrontation would produce the same cycle as everything else. Acknowledgement, adjustment, 3 weeks, return. And that the only productive response was to address the environment rather than the person. I bought a smart thermostat with a lock function that required a code to change the temperature, installed it over a weekend, and told Bet the landlord had asked us to use it to monitor energy usage, which was not true, but which was also not the kind of thing she could verify. The thermostat held. I started showering at irregular times that she could not anticipate, which broke the interval because the interval had depended on predictability. For the package situation, I signed up for a service that held deliveries at a nearby location, removing the buzzer from the equation entirely. The 10 months concluded, and I moved out without drama. Bet gave me a pleasant goodbye. I gave her one in return. I have thought about her occasionally since, and I find that my primary feeling is something close to admiration for the consistency of the operation, which was maintained over 10 months without a single instance that was individually provable, and which required a level of sustained attention to my patterns and schedule that, any directed elsewhere, would have been genuinely impressive. That's where that one lands. The 3-week interval is the tell, and the narrator identifying it as a pattern rather than a series of failed resolutions is the moment where the story shifts from a complaint about a difficult roommate to something more specific. The recognition of a system. Bet's operation was sophisticated precisely because it relied on the target's own charitable interpretation of individual events to prevent them from assembling the individual events into a picture. The smart thermostat with the fake landlord justification is the countermeasure that actually works, because it changes the environment without requiring Bet to acknowledge the pattern, which she would have denied anyway. Some people are conflict averse in the direction that produces the most conflict, and the only way to live alongside them is to remove the mechanisms they're using without having the conversation they're avoiding. The next story is from someone who discovered at month 4 that their roommate had been subletting the apartment to a third person during the hours when the narrator was at work. which raised several questions about the lease, about consent, and about the specific smell in the living room that had been unaccounted for. I worked a standard 9 to 5 with a commute. That meant I left the apartment at 8 in the morning and returned at 6:30 in the evening. My roommate, a man named Victor, Aris, worked a schedule that was less structured. He was a freelance sound engineer who worked evenings and weekends for the most part and was home during the day. I knew this about Victor before I moved in and had decided it was fine because our schedules were complementary enough that we would rarely be in common spaces simultaneously, which I had found from experience to be one of the more reliable predictors of a functional roommate relationship. What I did not know was that Victor had made a business decision about the hours between 8 and 6:30 that did not involve me and did not appear anywhere in our shared lease. He was renting out the living room on a per-hour basis through a platform designed for people who needed temporary workspace. Our living room, with its large windows and moderately attractive mid-century furniture that had come with the apartment, was apparently well suited to the aesthetic requirements of people who needed to conduct meetings or record content or take professional photographs against a background that did not look like a living room but did. Victor had been doing this, I would eventually calculate, approximately 4 days a week for the 3 months before I found out. I found out because I came home early. Not dramatically early. 2 hours at 4:30 because a meeting had been canceled and I had decided to work from home for the remaining portion of the afternoon. I let myself into the apartment and found a woman I had never seen before, sitting at our kitchen table with a ring light and a laptop, conducting what appeared to be a recorded interview with herself. She was not startled by my entry. She said hello with the ease of someone who had been in this space before and considered it a familiar work environment. I said hello with the ease of someone who was processing something unexpected while attempting not to make it the other person's problem. I went to my room, closed the door, and sent Victor a message asking if he had a moment to talk. He did not respond until the woman had left, at which point he knocked on my door and came in with the expression of someone who had been formulating an explanation for 2 hours and was ready to deliver it. He said he had been using the space to generate some additional income while it was otherwise unoccupied, that the people he had rented it to were vetted and professional, that nothing had been damaged, and that he had not told me because he had thought it would seem stranger than it was, and had told himself he would mention it when the right moment came up. I asked him several specific questions. Whether he had disclosed the arrangement to our landlord. He said no. Whether the lease permitted subletting the common areas on a commercial basis. He looked at the ceiling in a way that suggested he had checked and did not want to report the results. Whether any of the income he had generated had been offered to me, given it that it was our shared living room that was being rented. He said he had not considered that angle. I said I thought that was an interesting thing not to have considered. I did not ask him to stop entirely, which surprised him and may have surprised you. What I asked was for 3 things: that he disclose the arrangement to the landlord and get written approval, that he share the income from the living room on a 50-50 basis, going forward, given that the living room was equally mine, and that he give me advance notice on days when the space would be in use, so I could make arrangements if I needed to come home early. He agreed to all 3 with the specific compliance of someone who had been expecting a significantly worse outcome. The landlord approved the arrangement with conditions which I had not expected, but which turned out to be a function of the landlord's own interest in the revenue potential of the building's other units. Victor and I split the living room income for the remaining 8 months of our lease, which amounted to a not insignificant contribution to my monthly expenses. The space became tidier and better lit during the period of its commercial use, because Victor invested in maintaining it for his clients, which benefited me on the evenings when I used it. I met several of the recurring renters and found them pleasant in the way of people who are in your home briefly and professionally and have no interest in its personal dimensions. When I tell this story, the detail people fix on is the income split, which they find either fair or audacious, depending on their disposition. What I fix on is the ceiling look when I asked about the lease. That look was the whole story in 1 second. The look of someone who had read the lease, found the answer, decided the answer was not going to stop them, and had been carrying the knowledge of that gap between what they were doing and what they were permitted to do for 3 months before I walked in at 4:30 on a canceled meeting Tuesday. And that's that. Victor's operation was not malicious. It was entrepreneurial in a way that simply did not account for the co-ownership dimension of the space being rented, which is a significant omission that the ceiling look confirms was not an accident of oversight. The narrator's response is the most practically intelligent one available, not a termination of the arrangement, which would have produced resentment and resolved nothing financially, but a restructuring of it into something that acknowledged the shared nature of the resource being commercialized. The income split is either fair or audacious, depending on your disposition, and the correct disposition is fair. It was their living room, too. Here's one from someone whose roommate situation was, by most measures, completely fine, until the roommate's boyfriend effectively became an undisclosed third roommate and changed the entire math of the apartment. My roommate was a woman named Priya, and she was, as a roommate, genuinely good. Clean, considerate, communicative in the way that makes shared living significantly easier than the alternative. We had established an easy rapport in the first month that made the apartment feel like a home rather than a logistical arrangement, which was not something I had experienced in a previous roommate situation, and which I valued accordingly. I told people Priya was the best roommate I had ever had, and I meant it as a specific, rather than general compliment. The boyfriend's name was Samir, and I had met him in month 1 and found him agreeable. He came over on weekends, he was friendly and unobtrusive, and he cleaned up after himself without being asked, and he left by Sunday evening without requiring acknowledgement. For the first 3 months of the lease, Samir was exactly the kind of partner a roommate has. Present occasionally, pleasant consistently, and not a factor in the daily texture of the apartment. Month 4 was when the frequency shifted. Samir began appearing on weeknights, not every weeknight, at first 2 or 3, then gradually more, until by month 5, he was present in the apartment more evenings than he was not. He was still clean and friendly and unobtrusive in his manner. The issue was not his manner, and the issue was the mathematics of shared space under conditions of occupancy that had not been part of the original agreement. The shower situation was the first concrete expression of the mathematics. We had 1 bathroom. I showered at night. Priya showered in the morning. Samir showered. I discovered through the process of the water heater failing to recover. Apparently, whenever the spirit moved him, which was sometimes at night and sometimes in the morning, and occasionally at both. The water heater was sized for 2 people. 3 people used it differently. The kitchen told the same story in different numbers. Priya and I had found a grocery rhythm that worked for both of us. We did not share food formally, but we had calibrated our separate purchasing and storage to the space available, and to each other's patterns in a way that had become comfortable. Samir's presence added a 3rd pattern to the calibration, without any adjustment to the space, which expressed itself as a refrigerator that was consistently more full than it had been designed to accommodate, and a cabinet situation that required a kind of spatial reasoning that I had not signed up for. The utilities followed the same logic. I did not track usage with the precision of some people in tonight's stories, but I knew what our bills had been in months 1 through 3, and I knew what they became in months 4 through 7. And the increase was not attributable to seasonal changes, because the seasonal direction was wrong for the billing period in question. I had the conversation with Priya directly, and without building to it. which is my general approach to necessary conversations. I told her I had noticed Samir was spending significantly more time at the apartment than the original arrangement had accounted for, and that the increased occupancy was affecting the shared resources in ways that felt unequal. I said I liked Samir, and I was not asking her to see him less. I was asking whether we could talk about the arrangement in a way that reflected the actual situation, rather than the one from the lease signing. Priya received this well, which I had expected because she was the kind of person who received things well. She acknowledged the shift and said she had been aware it was happening and had not raised it because she had not known how to. We talked through it and arrived at an arrangement in which Samir contributed a monthly amount to utilities and a supplemental amount to the household's shared resources, which Priya sourced from him and transferred to me as a household expense adjustment. The amount was modest, and the negotiation was not the point. The point was the acknowledgement that the apartment's occupancy had changed in a way that had costs, and that the costs should be distributed according to the reality rather than the original paperwork. Samir was unofficially a third roommate for the remaining 7 months of the lease. He continued to be clean and friendly, and he brought good things from the bakery near his apartment, sometimes on weekend mornings, and I found that I did not object to his presence once the presence had been accounted for. When Priya and Samir moved in together at the end of the lease, it was neither a surprise nor a loss. It was the natural conclusion of something that had been the practical reality for most of the year we had shared. There it is. The mathematics of shared space is the thing this story is really about. Not the boyfriend as a character or a problem, but the boyfriend as a unit of occupancy, whose presence had costs that were being distributed unevenly in the direction of the person who had not made the choice to add the unit. The narrator's directness with Priya is the move that makes this story resolve well rather than badly, and Priya's reception of it is the thing that allows the resolution to be actual rather than performative. The bakery pastries on weekend mornings are the detail that tells you the arrangement found its right shape. Not because they constitute payment, but because they are the behavior of someone who understands they are a guest, who has become something more, and is trying to account for it in the ways available to them. Some roommate situations change during the lease, and the only question is whether they change in a way that everyone acknowledges or in a way that one person absorbs silently until it becomes resentment. The last story for tonight is from someone who lived with a person who was, across 18 months, one of the most considerate and pleasant roommates they ever had, and who discovered on moving day that the consideration had been organized around a secret that changed the texture of everything that had preceded it. His name was Oliver, and he was the kind of roommate who made living with a stranger feel like the easiest arrangement in the world. He was tidy without being rigid about it. He cooked well and shared freely, which is a combination that is rarer than it sounds. He had friends who came over occasionally, and who were, without exception, people I found myself genuinely happy to encounter. He had a quality of genuine consideration for shared space that expressed itself not through rules or systems, but through a kind of ambient attentiveness. He noticed when things needed doing, and did them, and the noticing and doing were so natural that they produced a household that functioned well without any of the negotiation that shared living usually requires. 18 months. I will say again, 18 months of the most functional and pleasant roommate situation I had been in as an adult. I had recommended Oliver to friends looking for roommates. I had told people that living with someone you didn't know could be genuinely good, and used Oliver as my evidence. I liked Oliver. I think Oliver liked me. The apartment was a good place to live. On moving day, I was moving out, having gotten my own place after a raise that finally made the arithmetic work. We did the ordinary work of moving day together with the ease of people who had operated in the same space for long enough to move around each other without effort. He helped me carry things to the moving van. I bought lunch. We sat on the mostly emptied floor of my bedroom. eating sandwiches and talking about the 18 months in the easy retrospective way that good endings allow. He told me something in that conversation that he said he had been meaning to tell me for a while, and that moving day felt like the right moment because we were at the end of something, and the end of something seemed like the right place for it. He told me that when we had first been matched as roommates, before we met in person, he had looked me up online in the way that people do. My professional presence, my social accounts, the ordinary publicly visible accumulation of a person's digital life. He said he had found in the process of looking that we had a mutual connection, someone who had known us both in different contexts years before we met. He said the mutual connection was someone I had had a complicated history with, and that he had understood this from my side of the public record of the situation. He said he had decided not to mention the mutual connection before we met because he had thought it would make the meeting strange before it had a chance to be ordinary. He said it continued not to feel like the right moment to mention it across the following weeks, and then the weeks became months, and the months became the comfortable rhythm of the 18 months, and at each point, the telling felt like it would introduce a complication into something that was working well without it. He said he was telling me now because we were at the end, and he felt he owed me the telling before we were fully done. I ate my sandwich and thought about the mutual connection, and about the complicated history, and about 18 months of a roommate relationship I had valued, and the specific new layer the telling was placing over those 18 months. The layer was not dark exactly. Nothing Oliver had done was harmful. He had been the excellent roommate I had experienced him to be, without the mutual connection ever making itself visible. But the 18 months now had something underneath them that had been there the whole time, and that I was only learning about on moving day, which was its own particular kind of information. I asked Oliver why that moment, why moving day specifically, was the right moment. He said because it meant I had all of the information before we were fully out of each other's lives, but after the part of things where the information could make the apartment uncomfortable. He had timed the disclosure to cause the minimum possible disruption to the arrangement, while still making the disclosure before the arrangement concluded. He said he was aware this was a calculation, and he was not sure it was the right one, but it was the one he had made. I finished my sandwich, and I thought about the calculation. It was considerate in the specific way that all of Oliver's behavior had been considerate, organized around the comfort and function of the situation, attentive to the ways information travels and the costs it carries. It was also a calculation made on my behalf without my participation, which was the thing I turned over most in the following weeks. He had decided for 18 months that I was better off not knowing something about the person I was living with, and the decision had produced 18 good months and this conversation on a moving day floor. And I was not certain he was wrong, but I was also not certain he was right. I gave him a warm goodbye. It was genuine. I took my boxes and I drove to my new apartment, and I thought about the mutual connection and about what it would have meant to know it at the beginning rather than the end. And I could not determine whether the knowing would have made the 18 months better, or worse, or simply different. And the inability to determine it is the part I have sat with longest. Oliver and I have had coffee twice since moving day. He is as good a person to have coffee with as he was to live with. And, short, I have not brought up the disclosure again, and neither has he. There is something sitting between us that we are both aware of, and that we have both decided does not need to be the subject of every conversation, which is its own kind of consideration, and probably the only version of resolution this particular situation makes available. That's where we'll leave things tonight. Oliver's timing of the disclosure is the thing the story keeps returning to. The decision to tell at the moment of maximum information transfer and minimum disruption, which is a genuinely considerate calculation, and also a unilateral one. made on behalf of another person who might have preferred to make it themselves. The 18 months being good does not answer the question of whether they would have been good with the knowing. And the unanswerable quality of that question is what makes this a different kind of roommate story from the others tonight. Most roommate stories end with someone revealed as worse than they appeared. This one ends with someone revealed as more calculated than they appeared, which is not the same thing, and is harder to know what to do with. This one is from someone who spent 6 months living with a person who never said anything directly unpleasant and managed, through that restraint alone, to make the apartment feel like a place where something was always about to go wrong. My roommate's name was Carla, and she communicated exclusively through implication. Not subtext exactly. Subtext requires the surface text to be doing something. Carla's surface text was almost entirely absent. What she had instead was a vocabulary of sighs, pauses, and a specific quality of looking at things that managed to convey disappointment without ever attaching the disappointment to a subject. She could look at a dish in the drying rack and produce, through the quality of her looking, the impression that the dish represented a moral failing, without saying anything about the dish, without touching the dish, without acknowledging that she had looked at the dish at all. I would become aware of the looking and feel the implication of it, and find myself defending the dish in my own head against a charge that had never been formally made. This is an exhausting way to share an apartment with someone. I want to be clear about the specific texture of the exhaustion, which was not the exhaustion of conflict. There was no conflict, which was part of the problem, but the exhaustion of continuous low-level alertness, of living in a space where the air had a quality of held breath that never fully released. I started spending more time in my bedroom, not because my bedroom was particularly appealing, but because it was the only room in the apartment where Carla's implications could not reach me. Month 3. I tried to address it directly. I told Carla I had the sense that she was sometimes unhappy with things in the apartment, and I asked if there was anything she wanted to talk about. She looked at me with an expression of gentle surprise and said everything was fine. She was just a quiet person, and she hoped I wasn't feeling uncomfortable. The delivery was perfect, warm, slightly concerned for me, entirely deflecting. I came away from the conversation feeling as though I had been the one expressing a problem, and she had been the one reassuring me, which was not how the conversation had been intended to go. I spoke to a friend about it, and the friend asked me to describe a specific instance. I described the dish look. The friend asked whether the dish look had produced any actual consequences. I said no. The friend said it sounded like I was living with someone whose vibe I didn't like, which was not the same as someone doing something specific, and that my options were limited by the absence of a specific thing to address. I said I understood the distinction, and that the absence of a specific thing was a specific thing. The friend considered this and agreed it was a real problem without a clean solution. What I eventually settled on was a kind of deliberate obtuseness. I stopped reading the implications. When Carla looked at something with the quality of implication, I looked at the thing myself and found it acceptable and moved on. When a sigh accompanied my presence in the kitchen, I treated the sigh as a respiratory event rather than a communication. The strategy required effort in the beginning and became easier with practice, and by month 5, I had achieved a functional immunity to the implication vocabulary that made the remaining weeks significantly more livable. Carla, I suspect, found this unsatisfying. The implication vocabulary is designed to produce a response, ideally a defensive or accommodating response that confirms the communicator's power over the situation. The deliberate obtuseness removed the response and left the implications hanging in the air without landing anywhere. I do not know whether she was aware of the shift in my approach or simply noticed that the apartment had become less responsive. Either way, the final month was the most comfortable of the 6, which I took as confirmation that the obtuseness had been the right countermeasure. I have encountered the implication vocabulary in workplaces and in other relationships since. I recognize it faster now. The deliberate obtuseness is easier to deploy when you understand what it is responding to and why, and the practice of 6 months with Carla gave me a fluency in the counter strategy that I have found genuinely useful in contexts well beyond shared living. She was a difficult roommate, and she was also, in this specific way, an education. And that's that. Carla's implication vocabulary is one of the more recognizable things in tonight's collection, because most people have encountered a version of it, and most people have found it difficult to address precisely because it produces no addressable surface. You cannot respond to a sigh. You cannot argue with a look. You cannot file a grievance about the quality of someone's silence. The narrator's deliberate obtuseness is the right response to the specific problem, because it targets the mechanism rather than the person. The implication needs a receiver to function, and withdrawing the receiver dismantles the system more effectively than any direct confrontation could. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do with a person who communicates entirely through implication is simply decline to be implied at. Next up, someone who moved into what they believed was a normal apartment and discovered 3 months in that their roommate had a system for everything, including several things the narrator had not known it was possible to have a system for. I want to be precise about the word system, because it is doing a lot of work in this story, and I want you to understand the specific register. I do not mean organized. Organized people have systems that make shared living easier, and I have no complaints about organized people. What my roommate Ned had was something beyond organization, into a territory that I would describe, after 7 months of exposure to it, as systematic for its own sake. The maintenance of systems as a way of life, rather than as a means to an end, which produces a very different living experience than organization does. The kitchen had a system that took me 2 weeks to fully map. Dishes were organized not by type, as is conventional, but by frequency of use and projected frequency of use. Categories that were not the same thing, and that Ned had spent considerable time determining. The spice cabinet had a rotational logic based on a projected cooking schedule that Ned maintained in a spreadsheet. The refrigerator had zones that were labeled on a laminated card attached to the inside of the door, with the specific placement of items within zones, governed by rules that the card explained in 8-point font across both sides. I read the card on my first full day in the apartment and retained approximately 30% of it, and spent the following weeks receiving corrections through post-it notes attached to items I had misplaced. The post-it notes were their own system. They were color-coded. Yellow notes were informational, gentle reminders about systems I had not yet internalized. Orange notes were corrective, indications that something had been placed or done incorrectly. I never received a red note, and I do not know what a red note would have indicated, because the color coding explained itself only through yellow and orange, and I had internalized enough of the systems by month 2 that orange became infrequent, and the bathroom had a timeline posted on the inside of the cabinet door that indicated the expected replacement schedule for every shared consumable: toilet paper, hand soap, the specific cleaning products Ned used on the specific surfaces he used them on. Each item had a replacement date projected from the date of installation, based on Ned's calculated average consumption, which he had arrived at through a period of measurement he had conducted before I moved in, and which he had since recalibrated to account for my consumption patterns, which he had apparently been tracking without mentioning it. I discovered the tracking in month 3. I asked him about it directly, and he explained, without apparent awareness of how the explanation might land, that he tracked consumable usage across the apartment because it allowed him to project replacement costs accurately and to identify anomalies in consumption that might indicate waste or misuse. He said my patterns were within acceptable parameters. I thanked him for the information and went to my room and sat with the specific quality of someone who has just learned they are within acceptable parameters without having agreed to be measured. The thing is, and I want to be honest about this because the honest version is more complicated than the simple version. Ned's systems worked. The apartment functioned at a level of operational efficiency I had never experienced in shared housing. Things were always where they were supposed to be. Consumables were always replenished before they ran out. The kitchen ran cleanly, and the bathroom was always in order. And the shared spaces had a quality of maintenance that required almost no attention on my part, because Ned's attention was total and continuous. I contributed to the systems, I followed the guidelines, and I lived in the most smoothly functioning apartment of my adult life. I did not renew the lease when it came up. Not because of anything that had gone wrong. Nothing had gone wrong in any conventional sense. But because 7 months of living inside someone else's total systematic management of a shared space had produced in me a specific desire to live in a space that was merely good enough by the standards of a single person, rather than optimized to the specifications of a person who measured my toothpaste consumption without mentioning it. There is a cost to frictionless living when the friction is being absorbed entirely by another person's system, and you are simply moving through it. And the cost is a kind of passivity about your own environment that I found I did not want to continue accumulating. Ned found a new roommate within a week. I suspect the new roommate's consumption patterns were evaluated and found within acceptable parameters before the lease was signed. There it is. The color-coded post-it note system is the image that captures Ned most completely. Yellow for informational, orange for corrective, red presumably for something that never needed to happen, because Ned's systems were thorough enough to catch problems before they reached red. The narrator's honest acknowledgement that the systems worked is what keeps this from being a simple complaint. The apartment was genuinely better run than most, and the thing the narrator is leaving is not dysfunction, but a specific kind of effortless living that turned out to feel like not quite being in their own home. Being within acceptable parameters without having agreed to be measured is the line that names the specific strangeness of Ned's arrangement. And the desire to live somewhere merely good enough on one person's terms, rather than optimize on another's, is the most honest articulation of why functional isn't always enough. This one is from someone whose roommate was perfectly pleasant for 4 months and then left for a 2-week trip and returned as someone the narrator did not recognize. His name was Tom, and he was, and in the first 4 months, everything the listing had suggested. Easygoing, funny in a low-key way. Someone who held up his end of things without needing to be prompted. We had fallen into a comfortable rhythm that required no maintenance because neither of us had produced anything that needed to be maintained. I had stopped thinking about the roommate situation as a situation, which is the ideal state of a roommate situation. He went on a trip in month 4. A 2-week thing, a friend's extended celebration in another country. The kind of trip that people his age take when they have the vacation time and the disposable income. And a friend with a birthday that warrants the destination. He left on a Thursday in good spirits. I had the apartment to myself for 2 weeks, which I enjoyed in the way of someone who is used to sharing a space and finds occasional solitude. Restorative rather than lonely. He returned on a Thursday. I heard the door and called hello from the kitchen, and the response had a quality that I registered without being able to name. Not unfriendly, just different. The frequency was slightly wrong, the way that an instrument slightly out of tune sounds familiar enough to recognize, and wrong enough to notice. The following week established the new frequency as a pattern rather than a travel return anomaly. Tom was withdrawn in a way he had not been before the trip. Not hostile, not cold, but present in the apartment with a quality of interior preoccupation that had not previously characterized his presence. He had conversations with me that were complete in their surface structure and that communicated, beneath the surface, that he was somewhere else while we were having them. I gave it 2 weeks on the theory that international travel and reentry have their own adjustment curves and that the frequency would return to the pre-trip register once the adjustment completed. The 2 weeks did not produce the return I had expected. The interior preoccupation persisted, and in month 6, it had settled into what I understood was simply the new version of Tom, the post-trip version, different from the pre-trip version, in ways I could not specifically name, and that did not constitute anything I could raise directly. I raised it indirectly. I asked him one evening if everything was okay, in the way that people ask when they already know the answer is more complicated than fine. He said he was going through some things. I said I had noticed and I was around if he wanted to talk. He said he appreciated that. We did not talk beyond that exchange in month 6. In month 7, he told me what had happened on the trip, which was a significant and painful thing involving a person he had expected to spend the future with, and who had, in the context of the 2 weeks in another country, communicated something about their mutual future that had reorganized Tom's understanding of what he was going back to. He had come home to an apartment and a job and a life that had assumed a shape based on an expectation that no longer existed. And the process of living inside that shape while understanding it differently was what the interior preoccupation had been about. The roommate situation was not the story. The story was Tom and something that had happened to him. The roommate situation was just the place where I watched the story from, which I think is worth saying because it reframes what the 6 months after the trip actually were. Not a roommate problem, just a person going through something difficult in an apartment they shared with someone who cared about them and did not know how to help, and decided that being available without requiring anything was the version of help that was appropriate. Tom is doing better. I know this because we are still in contact, which is not something I can say about most people I have lived with. He moved out when his lease was up and found his own place, and the own place version of him is, from what I can tell, closer to the pre-trip version than the 6 months after the trip were. He brought me a plant when I had him over for dinner recently. It is still alive, which I take as a good sign about both the plant and the general direction of things. That's the full picture. This one sits differently from the others tonight, because the roommate is not doing anything to the narrator. The narrator is simply proximate to something private and painful, sharing space with a person who has come back from a trip as a different version of themselves, without being able to explain why yet. The choice to be available without requiring anything is the right roommate move in this situation, and also a genuinely decent human move. And the fact that they are still in contact, and the plant is still alive, is the quiet confirmation that the choice was the right one. Not every difficult roommate situation is about the roommate. Sometimes the apartment is just the place where someone's life changes. And the most useful thing you can be is the person who noticed and didn't make it worse. Last one for tonight, from someone whose roommate nightmare was not a person at all, but a series of escalating decisions their roommate made about a pet that had not been disclosed before move-in. When I agreed to move in with a woman named Sasha, she had one cat. The cat was named Pepper and was present at the apartment viewing in the way of a cat who has decided to perform accessibility for the benefit of a prospective tenant. Visible, non-aggressive, occupying a corner of the couch with the settled quality of something that has decided it belongs there and is correct about this. I'm not allergic to cats. I do not have strong feelings about cats in either direction. I said Pepper was fine, and I meant it, and I signed the lease. 3 months later, Sasha acquired a second cat. She did not discuss this with me before acquiring it. The acquisition appeared on a Saturday morning as a carrier in the hallway, and a new small face looking out through the mesh at me with a specific expression of a creature that has just arrived somewhere new and is reserving judgment. The new cat's name was Oregano. I received oregano as a development I had not been consulted about, and I said something to Sasha about the consultation I had not received. She said she hadn't thought it would be a big deal. I said I appreciated that, but that the apartment was a shared space, and additions to the household that affected the shared space were things I thought warranted a conversation first. She said she understood and she was sorry, and oregano was very calm and wouldn't be a problem. Oregano was not the problem. Or rather, oregano was not the last problem. Month 5 brought an announcement delivered with the quality of someone who has learned from experience that some announcements are better made after the fact than before. Sasha told me she was fostering a dog, temporarily, through a rescue organization. The dog's name was Biscuit, and it was already in the apartment when she told me, standing in the kitchen with the earnest bewilderment of a medium-sized animal in an unfamiliar environment. I looked at Biscuit. I looked at Sasha. I thought about the consultation conversation from month 3 and its apparent impact on her decision-making process. I asked how long temporary was. She said 4 to 6 weeks. I said I would have appreciated knowing before Biscuit arrived. She said she knew and she was sorry, and Biscuit was very calm and wouldn't be a problem. Biscuit was somewhat of a problem. Not in character. Biscuit was, as advertised, a calm dog, with the kind of gentle bewilderment that large, gentle animals have when they are trying very hard to understand a situation that is not designed for them. The problem was logistical. The apartment was a 2-bedroom in a building that technically did not permit dogs. And as Sasha had decided this was a technicality she could navigate and had been correct in the sense that the building management had not noticed and would, presumably, continue not to notice for 4 to 6 weeks. The problem was that the not noticing required a level of covert dog management that added a layer of operational complexity to the apartment that had not existed before Biscuit. The 4 to 6 weeks became 9 weeks. I know this because I counted. At week 7, Sasha mentioned that Biscuit's adoption had not finalized as expected, and that he needed a bit more time. At week 9, she said she had been thinking about it and had decided to adopt Biscuit herself, which was when I understood that the fostering had always been a precursor to the adoption and that the temporary framing had been a way of introducing the situation in portions that were individually more acceptable than the whole would have been presented at once. I told Sasha I wanted to talk about the apartment's animal situation, comprehensively rather than on an item-by-item basis. She sat down with the expression of someone who had been expecting this conversation and was prepared to be reasonable about it. I said we had gone from 1 cat to 2 cats, to a foster dog, to an adopted dog, across 5 months, without a single one of those additions being discussed with me before it happened. I said the additions had each individually been manageable, and that the sum of them was a 2-bedroom apartment containing 3 animals, at least one of which violated the building's pet policy, that bore no resemblance to the situation I had agreed to when I signed the lease. Sasha said she understood and that she could see. It looked like a pattern. I said it was a pattern. She said she had not experienced it as a pattern because each decision had felt independent to her. I said I understood that and that it was a pattern regardless of whether it had felt like one from her side, and that going forward, I needed us to agree that any changes to the apartment's animal population required a conversation with me before the animal arrived, rather than after. She agreed. She kept the agreement for the remaining months of the lease. Biscuit turned out to be a genuinely good dog, calm as advertised, grateful in the specific way of dogs who have been in uncertain situations and found themselves somewhere stable. Pepper and Oregano reached a detente with Biscuit that expressed itself as mutual avoidance with occasional moments of tentative curiosity that I found genuinely endearing in this specific way, of watching 3 animals navigate something none of them had been consulted about either. The lease ended, and we went separate ways without drama. I saw Sasha at a mutual friends gathering some months later, and she told me Biscuit had learned to open the kitchen cabinet, where the treats were kept. I said that sounded like something she had created. She agreed that it sounded like something she had created, and that's where we'll leave things for tonight. The incremental introduction of animals as a negotiating strategy is identified correctly as a pattern, even though each individual decision was made independently, which is the specific kind of accounting error that the narrator is right to name. The experience of the person on the receiving end of a series of independent decisions is the experience of a pattern, regardless of the internal experience of the person making the decisions. The conversation that finally names it as a pattern, rather than addressing each instance individually, is the move that produces the actual change, because it identifies the structural issue rather than the surface one. And Biscuit learning to open the treat cabinet is the right ending image, the consequence of an animal acquired through a fostering that was always heading toward an adoption, now fully at home and taking liberties, exactly as you would expect. This one is from someone who lived with a roommate for 11 months and only understood, on the last day of the lease, that the version of themselves their roommate had been presenting to their shared social world had been significantly different from the one they would have presented themselves. My roommate's name was Dana, and we had come into the living situation through a mutual friend, which I had believed was a better foundation than a stranger matching service, and which I now understand is simply a different set of risks, rather than a reduced set. We knew overlapping people. We had been at the same gatherings a handful of times before we decided to live together. The familiarity felt like a foundation. It was not exactly a foundation. It was more like a set of shared references that neither of us had examined closely enough to know whether they were load-bearing. The first 6 months were easy in the way that living with someone from your social circle can be easy. The shorthand that already exists between people who have mutual friends greases the adjustment period in ways that living with a stranger does not allow for. We talked in the kitchen. We watched things together occasionally. The apartment had a warmth that I attributed to compatibility, and that I now understand was at least partly the warmth of 2 people performing friendship for the people who had put them together. The thing I did not know was that Dana had an ongoing commentary about our living situation that she was sharing with the mutual social world, not with me present, with the people we both knew, at gatherings I was not at, in the group context that our shared social circle produced. I know this because it eventually made its way back to me through the specific mechanism of a friend who mentioned something that assumed I knew a version of an event that I had experienced differently. The friend mentioned a thing Dana had apparently described about an incident in month 4, an argument we had had about a shared grocery bill that had, from my perspective, been a brief and resolved disagreement about math. In Dana's version, as it had been circulating, the incident was longer, more heated, and had been initiated by me in a way that did not match my memory of how it had started. The version that had been circulating in our social world for 7 months was not my version. I went through what I could access of the social record, and what I found suggested that Dana had been narrating our living situation to our shared social world on a continuous basis, with me as a character in the narration whose behavior was consistently framed in a slightly less favorable light than my own experience of the events warranted. Nothing dramatic, no accusations, no catastrophizing, just a steady accumulation of small framings that positioned Donna as the reasonable one, and me as the one who occasionally required management. I had not been doing the same thing. This is the part that I sat with longest. I had been living with Dana and having an experience of the living, and occasionally sharing things with my own separate friends who did not know Dana. And I had not been narrating us to our shared social world because it had not occurred to me that there was a narration happening. The asymmetry was not dramatic. But it had been running for 11 months in a world of people we both knew and would continue to know after the lease ended. And by the time I found out about it, the narration had been building a picture I had not been given the opportunity to be part of. I raised it with Donna in month 11. Not as an accusation, because the individual instances were each small enough to be individually defensible, but as an observation about what I had found and what it suggested about how she had been processing our living situation and with whom. She received it with the specific quality of someone who had known that this conversation was eventually possible and had prepared a position for it. She said she had just been venting to friends, which everyone does. I said I understood that, and that what I was noting was not the venting, but the consistent direction of the framing, across 11 months and across a social world we both inhabited, which had produced a version of me that was circulating without my participation. She said she had not thought of it that way. I believe she had not thought of it exactly that way, because the thinking would have required her to examine the narration as a whole, rather than as individual instances of venting. And individual instances of venting are easier to justify than the accumulated architecture of them. I told her I understood the distinction, and that understanding it did not make the architecture less real. The lease ended without further drama. The social world adjusted in the way that social worlds adjust when a living situation concludes. The narration presumably stopped being relevant, and therefore stopped circulating with the frequency it had been. Some of the mutual friends I noticed pulling slightly away in the months after the lease, I have since attributed to the 11 months of narration rather than to anything that happened after. This is not certain. It is my best read of the available information. I have been more deliberate since about who I share living situation information with when I have a roommate who overlaps with my social world. Not because venting is wrong, venting is human and necessary, but because venting into a shared social world is not the same as venting into a private one, and the difference matters in the specific way that things you cannot take back matter. What circulates in a world of mutual acquaintances stays in that world in ways that private venting does not, and the asymmetry of one person narrating a shared living situation while the other is simply living it is its own quiet form of disadvantage. That's where that one lands. The asymmetry is the thing. Dana narrating a shared experience to a shared social world, while the narrator was simply having the experience, without knowing a narration was in progress. Each individual instance of the narration was defensible as ordinary venting. But the accumulated architecture of 11 months of consistently framed stories about someone you share a kitchen with is something more structural than venting, and the narrator names that distinction cleanly, without requiring the individual instances to be malicious. Sometimes the most consequential thing a person does in a shared living situation is not what they do into the apartment, but what they say about the apartment to the people who will know you both, long after the lease ends. Here's one from someone who moved into a 4-person apartment and discovered over the course of a year that 3 of those 4 people had a dynamic so established and so specific that the 4th position was functionally a rotating guest slot that nobody had mentioned at the listing stage. The apartment had 4 bedrooms and had been occupied by Riza, Justine, and Marcus for 2 years before I arrived to fill the vacancy left by someone named Theo, whose departure had been described in the listing as amicable and whose actual departure, I would eventually understand, had been the departure of someone who had spent several months in exactly the position I was about to occupy. The 3 of them had a life that was already complete, not hostile to additions, and they were warm people, individually warm, the kind of warmth that makes you feel welcome in the first weeks, without noticing that the welcome is the warmth of an established thing, receiving a visitor, rather than the warmth of something making room for a new member. The distinction is subtle and I did not catch it in the first month or in the second, or really until month 5 when I looked at a photograph from a gathering in our apartment and noticed that every photograph from every gathering in our apartment had me standing at the same slight remove from the 3 of them that the photograph had me at, and that the slight remove had been consistent across 5 months of social occasions, without anyone having placed me there deliberately. The apartment operated on rhythms I had not been consulted about, and that predated me by 2 years. There was a household dinner on Sunday evenings that the 3 of them had maintained since the beginning, and that I had been included in from the start, which I had taken as inclusion, and which I now understood was accommodation. They would have had the dinner regardless of my presence, and my presence at it was the presence of a guest who had been extended a standing invitation, rather than a member of the household who had helped establish the tradition. The distinction expressed itself in how the dinner was organized, which was by Reza and Justine and Marcus, making decisions about it in conversations I was adjacent to, rather than part of. The chores operated the same way. There was a system that had developed organically over 2 years, and that had the specific solidity of something that has found its shape through trial and error, and is no longer being examined. The system had 3 positions. I had been added to the system in month 1 in a way that gave me a 4th position, but the 4th position was a satellite of the 3-position system, rather than an integrated part of it. I had tasks that were mine alone, and that did not interact with the tasks of the other 3, in a way that would have made me structurally necessary, rather than structurally additional. I raised this in month 6 with Reza, who I had found the most individually approachable of the 3. Not as a complaint, I want to be accurate about this because I am aware it sounds like a complaint, and it was more complicated than a complaint. I told him I had noticed the apartment had a structure that had been established before I arrived, and that I was not certain I was part of the structure so much as adjacent to it, and I asked him whether that was an accurate read. He was quiet for a moment, and then said he thought there was something to that, and that it had not been intentional. I said I believed him, and that unintentional did not mean it wasn't real. We had a longer conversation. He talked to Justine and Marcos. The 3 of them apparently had a conversation among themselves that Reza reported back to me as having been useful and honest, though the content of it was summarized rather than shared. What changed after that conversation was modest. A slight adjustment in how decisions were discussed. An effort on the part of all 3 of them to route communications through the group, rather than among themselves before reaching me. It was enough to make the remaining months more genuinely comfortable without fully dissolving the structure that 2 years of prior living had built. When the lease came up, I chose not to renew. Not because of resentment. I did not feel resentful, or not primarily. I had genuinely liked all 3 of them, and the year had not been unpleasant. I left because I had understood by the end of it that the 4th position in a 3-person household that had been complete before your arrival is a position that requires the other 3 to actively work against their own established nature to make room for you, and that requiring people to work against their own established nature indefinitely is an unsustainable ask, regardless of how willing they are to try. The position was never going to be mine in the way that the other 3 positions were theirs. Theo had apparently understood the same thing. I know this because I eventually found him through a mutual acquaintance, and we had coffee, and he said approximately the same things I had been thinking, in slightly different words, and the recognition of the shared experience was its own particular comfort. There it is. The photograph detail is the one that makes the pattern visible. Every social occasion across 5 months, capturing the same slight remove, without anyone having placed it there deliberately, which is the most precise possible image of a dynamic that is structural, rather than personal. The distinction between accommodation and inclusion is the conceptual center of the story, and the narrator identifies it without bitterness, because the distinction is real. And the three original roommates were genuinely good people, rather than deliberately excluding ones. Theo having understood the same thing and being findable through a mutual acquaintance is the quietly perfect coda. The discovery that the fourth position has a predecessor who arrived at the same conclusion by the same route, which confirms the reading without requiring anyone to be blamed for the structure that produced it. This one comes from someone who had a roommate for 8 months, who was, in every practical sense, an excellent roommate, and who was running a side operation from the apartment that the narrator only found out about when the operation attracted external attention. My roommate's name was Felix, and he was tidy, punctual with bills, respectful of shared space, and present in the apartment in the easy, unobtrusive way that makes the difference between a functional shared living situation and one that requires continuous navigation. I had no complaints about Felix as a roommate. I want to establish this as the genuine state of affairs rather than a setup for dramatic contrasts. Because the thing I found out about Felix did not change the quality of his roommate behavior, which remained excellent throughout and after. What Felix was running from the apartment was a reselling operation of unusual scale. He bought things, electronics, collectibles, limited edition items, of the specific categories of object that have a gap between retail price and secondary market value large enough to sustain a business. And he resold them at the secondary market value through platforms that connected him with buyers. This was not unusual as a side operation. Many people do versions of it. What made Felix's version notable was the scale. I understood there was something large-scale happening from the frequency of deliveries. Our building had a package room, and the package room's capacity was finite, and Felix's deliveries were testing the capacity on a rotating basis. I had asked him about it in month 2, and he had said he bought and sold things as a hobby. And I had accepted this as a sufficient explanation because it was not inaccurate, just incomplete in its scale. And the external attention arrived in month 7 in the form of 2 men who knocked on our apartment door on a Tuesday evening looking for Felix. They were from a courier company, which was what they said, and they were trying to resolve a dispute about a shipment, which was also what they said, and the quality of how they said these things had a texture that I associated less with courier company representatives and more with people whose interest in finding Felix was more personal than professional. I told them Felix was not home, which was true, and that I did not know when he would be back, which was less true. I closed the door and I called Felix, and I told him what had happened and described the 2 men with the specificity available to me. And the silence on Felix's end of the call lasted long enough to tell me the description was recognized. Felix came home an hour later, and we had the conversation that the description of the 2 men had made necessary. What he told me was that the reselling operation had expanded into categories that had a more complicated legal relationship with their manufacturers than a standard retail items, which is a description I am choosing carefully because what he described occupied a gray area that I'm not going to characterize more specifically than gray. The men at the door were associated with a dispute about a large transaction that had not resolved in the way Felix had expected. I told Felix I had not agreed to live in an apartment that was associated with disputes of the kind that produced men at the door on a Tuesday evening. I told him I understood he had not disclosed the full scope of the operation because he had not expected the operation to become visible to me in this way. And I told him that the expectation had turned out to be wrong, and that I needed him to tell me what this meant for the apartment going forward. He was honest in the way of someone who had been caught by a development they had not anticipated, and who had decided that the most practical response was full disclosure. He told me the scope of the operation, the nature of the dispute, and what he expected the resolution to look like. The resolution, he said, did not involve the apartment in any way that would recur. The 2 men were a single incident associated with a single transaction that had gone wrong in a specific and non-repeating way. He was correct. The 2 men did not return. The apartment was not further involved. Felix resolved his dispute through channels I did not ask about, and the operation, as far as I could tell, continued at a reduced and more carefully managed scale. His behavior as a roommate did not change. The shared space continued to function with the same ease it had functioned with before the Tuesday evening. I did not end the lease early. I have thought about whether this was the right decision, and I've arrived at yes, contingently. Yes, given that the incident was genuinely singular, and the apartment was not implicated further, and given that Felix's honesty about the situation, after the fact, suggested he understood the line he had crossed by allowing the apartment to become even incidentally associated with his operation. The contingency is the part I hold, yes, be given those specific circumstances, and the circumstances mattered. The lease ended without further incident, and Felix moved to a larger space that I understood was better suited to the scale of what he was doing. He sent me a message on moving day that said he appreciated how I'd handled the Tuesday situation, which I found both gratifying and slightly absurd as a parting sentiment. I responded that I hoped the next chapter went smoothly. I meant it. Felix was a genuinely excellent roommate in the ways that roommates are most often difficult, and the way he was not excellent was unusual enough that I have told the story more times than I have told most roommate stories, which is its own kind of legacy, and that's that. The two men at the door on a Tuesday evening is the kind of incident that cannot be absorbed into the ordinary texture of shared living, regardless of how it resolves. Because the ordinary texture of shared living does not include disputes that produce unexpected visitors with a specific quality about how they say the things they say. Felix's honesty after the fact is what tips the narrator's decision towards staying rather than leaving, which is the right calculus. It is not the operation that determines the roommate situation's viability. It is what the person does when the operation becomes visible in a way they had not intended. Sometimes the most unexpected thing about a roommate situation is not the thing itself, but the quality of how the person handles it when the thing can no longer be managed quietly. This last one for tonight is from someone who had a roommate who was, by conventional measures, entirely unproblematic, and whose unproblematic quality turned out to be the result of the roommate not actually being present in the apartment for the significant majority of the lease. My roommate's name was Harriet, and I met her once before signing the lease, and approximately 6 times in the 11 months that followed. Not because she was avoidant or unfriendly. The 6 times we were in the apartment simultaneously, she was warm and easy company. The kind of person who converses naturally without requiring the conversation to be managed. She was simply almost never there. The absence established itself in the first 2 weeks. I had expected the ordinary calibration period of 2 people learning each other's schedules and patterns, and the calibration period did not produce the patterns I had expected, because Harriet's pattern was an absence that showed up Monday through Friday, with occasional weekend appearances that had the quality of someone visiting a storage unit rather than coming home. She was, I eventually understood, spending the vast majority of her time at her partner's apartment in a different neighborhood, and had been doing so for several months before I moved in, and had presumably been doing so for the foreseeable future. The apartment was effectively mine. I want to be honest that this was not, for the first 3 months, a problem. I had the kitchen to myself, the bathroom without scheduling, the living room without negotiating the television. I had the specific unearned luxury of a shared apartment priced at a shared apartment rate without most of the sharing. And I enjoyed it in the way of someone who has stumbled into a good deal without having sought it. Month 4 was when the unearned luxury began to have a slightly different quality. The apartment was very quiet. Not the quiet of a place where someone else is present in their room. The different, heavier quiet of a place where nobody else is. I had not anticipated the specific texture of nearly solo. Living in a space designed for 2 people and priced for 2 people, which is different from the texture of actually solo living in a space sized for 1. The 2 bedrooms, one consistently occupied and one consistently not, produced a spatial quality that I found difficult to name and increasingly difficult to not notice, as I mentioned it to Harriet in one of our concurrent apartment moments. She apologized with genuine warmth and said she had been meaning to be around more and that she would make an effort. The effort materialized as a slightly higher frequency of the storage unit visits. She was home 4 times in the following 2 weeks, rather than twice, which represented a significant percentage increase that did not substantially change the texture of the apartment. The practical complications arrived in month 6. A maintenance issue developed in the bathroom that required coordination with our landlord, and the landlord's communication was directed to both of us. And Harriet's response time to landlord communications was the response time of someone checking a secondary email account on an irregular schedule, which added 3 days to a repair timeline that had already been inconvenient. I handled the coordination because I was the one living in the apartment and experiencing the bathroom issue, and handling it required me to represent a 2-person lease in conversations where both parties were nominally responsible. I had a conversation with Harriet about the practical dimensions of her absence, not the absence itself, which was her business, but the way the absence interacted with the shared responsibilities of the lease in ways that defaulted to me. She acknowledged this with the same genuine warmth she brought to everything and said she would be more responsive and more available for the practical dimensions of the apartment. The responsiveness improved modestly and then returned to baseline within 3 weeks, which I recognized as a rhythm I had encountered in other contexts and had no expectation of changing. I adjusted my approach to the lease's practical requirements accordingly. I handled things, I documented what I handled, and I kept a record of it in a way that I shared with Harriet periodically so that she was informed without being relied upon to be proactive. The apartment functioned. The 11 months concluded, and Harriet moved out to formally move in with her partner, which had been the actual living situation for the entirety of our lease, even if the lease had not reflected it. She left a note with her key. The note thanked me for being such an easy person to live with. I read it standing in the hallway, and I thought about the 6 times we had been in the apartment simultaneously, and about the 11 months of a 2-person apartment that had functioned as a 1-person apartment at a 2-person price. And I thought about the note describing me as easy to live with, and I understood that easiness was perhaps not the quality the note intended to credit me with, but was probably the accurate description of what made the arrangement work from Harriet's perspective, which was that I was there and she was not, and neither of us made it a problem. I moved to a 1-bedroom the next time I needed to find a place. The monthly difference was not as large as I had expected, and the texture of the space was exactly what the 11 months with Harriet had been, without the occasional reminder that it was technically something else. That's where we'll leave things tonight. The storage unit visit quality of Harriet's presence is the image that defines the situation most precisely. Not unfriendly, not avoidant, just the presence of someone managing an obligation they have already mentally departed from, stopping by periodically to confirm the obligation still exists. The note describing the narrator as easy to live with is the ending detail that lands with a specific quiet humor. It is accurate from Harriet's perspective, because easiness is exactly what you call someone who manages a 2-person lease alone for 11 months, without making it anyone's problem. The move to a 1-bedroom being less expensive than expected is the final confirmation that the math of the previous situation had been off all along, and that the adjustment was smaller than it should have been, because the previous situation had already been most of the way there. This one is from someone who spent 9 months living with a roommate who was perfectly pleasant to their face and discovered, through a series of accidents, that the pleasantness had a precise geographic boundary that ended at the apartment door. My roommate's name was Jonah, and he was, in the apartment, one of the easier people I had shared space with. considerate about noise, reliable about bills, the kind of person who replaces the toilet paper without being asked, and who does not leave dishes in the sink for periods that require an intervention. When we were friendly in the low maintenance way that works well in shared housing, warm enough to make the space comfortable, undemanding enough to give each other room to live our separate lives inside it. I had no complaints about Jonah as a roommate, and I said so when asked. The first indication that the person Jonah was inside the apartment was not entirely the person Jonah was. Outside, it came from a colleague of mine who had encountered him at a bar in month 3. My colleague did not know Jonah was my roommate. She knew him from a different context, a social circle that overlapped with his, but not with mine. And she mentioned him in the way of someone relaying mildly interesting social information. She said he had been loud and dismissive in a way she found unpleasant. She said it without particular heat, just as a data point. I filed it and moved on. Month 5 produced a second data point from a different direction. A friend of mine who lived in our neighborhood mentioned that he had seen Jonah on the street and said hello, and that Jonah had looked through him in the way of someone who had decided the social transaction was not worth the energy required. My friend knew Jonah was my roommate and mentioned this as an observation rather than a complaint, with the mild curiosity of someone noting an inconsistency between versions of a person. I filed it with the first data point and began to feel the weight of the two together. Month 7 was the one that made the two data points into a picture. I was at a gathering with a group of people I did not know well, and I encountered someone who knew Jonah and who, when they found out I was his roommate, had a reaction that required a moment of recalibration before settling into something polite. The recalibration was brief and they covered it smoothly, but I had been watching for something since month 5 and I caught it. I asked directly whether they knew Jonah well. They said they had spent time in shared social contexts with him. I asked whether they would describe him as easy to be around. The pause before their answer was its own answer. I had accumulated enough by month 7 to understand that the Jonah in the apartment and the Jonah in the world were running on different operating systems. The apartment version was the one that had presumably been assembled for close proximity situations, where reputation has ongoing consequences. The version maintained with care, because shared living requires it. You, the world version, was the one that emerged when the ongoing consequences constraint was removed, which apparently produced someone that multiple people in multiple contexts had found unpleasant in ways they had not expected. I did not confront Jonah about this. The information I had was collected from people who were not present, about situations I had not witnessed, and the evidence did not constitute the kind of thing you can present to someone directly without either misrepresenting its certainty or disclosing the web of conversations that had assembled it. What I did was pay closer attention. Once I was paying closer attention to the apartment version of Jonah, I began noticing smaller things I had previously not examined. A quality in how he talked about people who were not in the room, a slight edge in his assessments of situations that involved him in a less than flattering light, a pattern in the way he attributed the causes of inconveniences in his life that consistently landed the attribution somewhere other than himself. None of these things were extreme. Together they had a texture. The 9 months concluded, and Jonah moved out for reasons unrelated to me. He had found a place closer to his job, and the timing aligned with the lease end. The goodbye was warm, in the way our entire apartment relationship had been warm. I was genuine in it because the apartment Jonah had been easy to live with, and I had no specific grievance to hold against the apartment version of him. What I held instead was a question I have not fully resolved, which is about the relationship between who a person is in their most accountable contexts and who they are in the ones that don't require the same maintenance. The apartment version of Jonah was the version produced by the specific accountability of shared space. The knowledge that the person across from you at breakfast can make your daily life easier or harder, depending on how you treat them. The world version was the version that existed when that accountability was absent. I do not know which one is more real. I suspect they are both real, and the question is what you do with the version that is easier to be. That's where that one lands. The recalibration at the gathering in month 7 is the moment where accumulated data becomes a picture, not a confrontation. Just the specific social micro-expression of someone who has had to adjust their face quickly, caught by a narrator who had been looking for something and knew what it looked like. The question at the end, which version of a person is more real, when they maintain two distinct ones, depending on the accountability of the context, is the right question to be left with. Not because it has an answer, but because it is the question that the specific shape of this situation makes available. Sometimes the easiest person to live with is easy to live with precisely because they understand that living with someone has consequences, and that understanding does not necessarily travel. The next story is from someone who moved into a 2-bedroom in good faith and spent 7 months discovering that good faith, the bus in the specific living situation they had entered, was functioning as a resource that their roommate was extracting. His name was Brandon, and he had a quality I have since learned to be more careful about, which was the quality of someone who is immediately and completely forthcoming about their own flaws. He told me on the day we met that he had a tendency to let administrative things slide. Bills, paperwork, the maintenance of systems that required regular attention. He said this with the self-awareness of someone who has examined themselves and arrived at an accurate finding, and I received it as honesty and planned accordingly. I would handle the administrative dimensions of the apartment. He would compensate through other contributions. This was the arrangement we discussed, and I believed we had agreed to. The contributions did not arrive in the form I had understood they would. Not because Brandon was dishonest about making them. He was consistently enthusiastic about the contributions he was about to make, in a way that suggested genuine intention, in the moment of the enthusiasm. What did not follow the enthusiasm was the execution. He would commit to handling the living room, and the living room would not be handled. And when I raised it, he would commit again with fresh enthusiasm, and an explanation for the previous gap that was plausible and that he clearly believed. This cycle had a period of approximately 2 weeks, and I experienced it across 7 months, without the cycle ever breaking into a different shape. Month 3 was when I understood that the self-awareness Brandon had presented at the beginning was not the precursor to change that self-awareness is supposed to be. It was a substitute for it. He knew he let administrative things slide, and he told people he knew it, and the telling appeared to function in his own accounting as a form of management, as though naming a pattern absolved him of the pattern's ongoing consequences and the lives of people around him. The self-awareness was real, and it was also, in its way, the most sophisticated feature of the system, because it preemptively inoculated him against the accusation of not knowing better. He always knew better. He simply did not do better, and the knowing was doing the work of the doing in his own internal accounting, without doing it into the shared space of the apartment. I adjusted my expectations in month 3, and then again in month 4, and then once more in month 5, and arrived by month 6 at a set of expectations that accurately reflected what Brandon was capable of contributing to the apartment, which was considerably less than what we had discussed at the beginning. The adjustment was not a decision so much as a series of small recalibrations that each felt reasonable in the moment and that collectively constituted a significant reduction in what I was requiring of him in exchange for what I was contributing. The reduction was the only thing that had reduced friction. But friction reduction is not the same as a functional arrangement, and by month 7, I had a friction-reduced living situation, in which Brandon contributed almost nothing to the shared operational requirements of the apartment, and I had quietly adjusted my expectations until his absence from those requirements no longer surprised me. I told him what I had noticed in month 7. not with anger. I want to be honest about that because the conversation could have been angry, and it was not. I told him that I had been adjusting my expectations across the lease in a direction that had arrived somewhere I had not intended to arrive, and that the arriving somewhere unintended was a process I had participated in through my own choices, and was also something he had produced through the gap between his stated intentions and his actual follow through. I told him the gap was real, and that I was naming it specifically because I thought he deserved specificity rather than the general disappointment I had been carrying, and he had been receiving signals of without being given the direct version. He received the conversation with the specific quality of someone who had heard versions of it before. Not defensive, not surprised, genuinely sorry, in a way that I believed, and that also existed inside a pattern of being genuinely sorry that had not historically produced the behavior change that genuine sorrow is supposed to precede. He committed to doing better. I believed the commitment, and I also understood that believing the commitment and expecting the outcome were different things, and I, adjusted my expectations accordingly, which by month 7 I had become quite practiced at. The lease ended, and we went separate ways without drama. Brandon texted a week after moving out to say the new place was going well, and that he was working on the administrative stuff. I said I was glad to hear it. I meant the first part with certainty. I held the second part with the patient uncertainty of someone who has learned that working on a thing and arriving somewhere different with it are not the same milestone, and that the distance between them is where most of the actual living happens. And that's that. The self-awareness as a substitute for change rather than a precursor to it is the specific mechanism this story is built around, and the narrator names it with precision. The knowing doing the work of the doing in Brandon's internal accounting without doing it in the shared space of the apartment. The series of small recalibrations that collectively constituted a significant reduction in expectations is something most people in long-term, difficult living situations will recognize. Each individual adjustment feels reasonable, and the sum of them is a situation you did not agree to and arrived at anyway. The direct conversation in month 7 being neither angry nor sufficient is the most honest ending available for a situation like this one. Because the conversation that names the pattern clearly is necessary, and also cannot by itself break the pattern, which has been running long enough to have its own momentum. Here's one from someone who shared a wall with their roommate for 10 months and discovered that the wall, while structurally present, was acoustically an almost entirely theoretical partition. As I knew going into the apartment that it was old. The building had been constructed in the 1940s and had the specific quality of old residential construction, which is charm in the common areas and an uncertainty in the private ones. High ceilings and good light in the living room. Walls in the bedrooms that turned out to have been installed with an optimism about sound transmission that the physics of the materials did not support. My roommate's name was Gwen, and she was a perfectly agreeable person, with whom I had no conflicts and no particular tensions across the 10 months. What she had, which the wall made intimately available to me, was a life. A full and specific life, with a telephone manner, and a friend group, and a relationship, and a professional situation, and opinions about all of these things, which she processed aloud with the natural volume of someone who had no reason to believe that the person in the next room was receiving the processing with the clarity of a live broadcast. I learned things about Gwen that I did not seek and could not avoid. I knew the specific nature of her relationship difficulty with her partner, which played out in a series of phone calls across months 3 through 6 that had the narrative coherence of a serialized drama with recurring themes and occasional climactic episodes. I knew her professional situation with a specificity that exceeded what most of her colleagues probably knew, because her calls about work happened in the evening when she had decompressed enough to be fully candid about what the decompression was from. I knew what she thought of her mother, which she discussed with her sister in a weekly call that had a consistent time and consistent content and that I came to anticipate with the resigned familiarity of a recurring scheduled obligation. I did not tell Gwen what I was receiving through the wall for the first 4 months because I was not certain she was aware of the transmission, and I did not want to make her self-conscious in her own bedroom. By month 4, I had accumulated enough detail about her life that the not telling had become its own complicated situation. I knew things that I had not been given, and the knowing without her knowledge of my knowing had a quality I found increasingly uncomfortable. I told her in month 5. I didn't tell her what I knew. I told her that the wall transmitted more than she might realize, and that I had been trying to be respectful about it, but that she should know that conversations in her bedroom were audible in mine. She was, to her credit, immediately and genuinely embarrassed rather than defensive. She apologized and said she had no idea, and asked what she could do to help manage it. We tried several things. A white noise machine on her side, which reduced, but did not eliminate the transmission. A bookcase repositioned against the shared wall, which had a modest dampening effect and also improved the layout of her room, which she appreciated. A general shift in her phone call location to the far corner of her bedroom, away from the wall, which helped with volume, if not with clarity. The transmission never fully resolved, and the wall was the wall, and the wall was old, and it had limits that furniture and white noise could modulate but not overcome. What changed was Gwen's awareness of it, which changed the nature of what I received. She was more conscious of her volume, more likely to take sensitive calls into the bathroom or the living room, more present to the idea that the private life she was living in her bedroom had an adjacency she had not previously accounted for. The 10 months produced a specific intimacy that was entirely involuntary, and that I have not known what to do with since. I know things about Gwen's relationship and her job and her family that she did not choose to share with me, and that I did not choose to receive. And the knowing sits in a category that does not have a clean name. Not gossip, because I've never shared it. Not confidence, because it was never offered. Just an accidental archive of someone else's private life that I accumulated through the specific and unromantic mechanism of plaster and lathe, failing to perform their intended function. Gwen and her partner worked through their difficulties. I know this because she told me in month 8, with a warmth that suggested she understood I had context for the update, without either of us having to name the context directly. I said I was glad, which I was. It was one of the stranger congratulations I have ever extended. There it is. The accidental archive is the concept that makes this story its own category among tonight's collection. Not a roommate who did something to the narrator, but a roommate whose simply living produced an intimacy that neither of them chose, and that the wall made inevitable. The narrator's discomfort with knowing things they hadn't been given is the most honest and specific detail. It is not the knowing itself that is uncomfortable, but the asymmetry of it, the way the information arrived without consent or context, and then had to be managed anyway. Gwen's warmth when sharing the relationship update in month 8, and the mutual understanding that operated beneath the surface of it, is the quietly specific image that ends this one. Two people in an apartment who have a shared knowledge that only one of them knows they share, navigating it with the particular grace of people who have decided not to make it more complicated than the wall already made it. This last one is from someone whose roommate situation lasted the full length of a 12-month lease and produced across those 12 months a single incident so specific and so baffling that it has remained the unchallenged centerpiece of every roommate horror conversation they have been part of since. I want to be clear before I tell you the incident that everything before and after it was normal. My roommate's name was Derek, and he was, across 11 months and 3 weeks of a 12-month lease, a completely unremarkable roommate in the best possible sense. Present enough to make the apartment feel inhabited, and absent enough to make it feel like mine. Clean without being rigid, financially reliable, pleasant in passing. I had told people who asked that Derek was the kind of roommate you hope for. and mean and forget about, which is the ideal state of a roommate and the way that a good referee is one you don't notice. The incident happened in month 11 on a Tuesday at approximately 2 in the afternoon. I was working from home, which I did 3 days a week, and I was at my desk in my bedroom with the door open because the apartment was warm and the cross ventilation required the bedroom door to be open. Derek was also home, which was not unusual. He worked a compressed schedule and had Tuesdays off. I was aware of him in the living room in the ambient way of someone sharing a space without actively sharing it. What I heard from the living room at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in month 11 was Derek having a conversation, a full, reciprocal, apparently comfortable conversation with someone who was not there. Not a phone call. The specific quality of a phone call is audible and distinct. The adjusted volume and the pauses calibrated for a signal delay. This was not that. This was a conversation conducted in the register of two people in the same room, with the natural rhythm and responsive quality of in-person dialogue, with no corresponding voice on the other end of any device I could identify. I sat at my desk for several minutes listening to this. Then I got up quietly and looked through the open door into the living room. Derek was sitting on the couch, facing slightly away from me, talking with the ease and specificity of someone engaged in genuine conversation. There was nobody else in the room. I went back to my desk and I sat down, and I thought about what I had heard. The range of explanations available to me was not large. A phone call on a device I could not see was the most charitable, and also the least acoustically consistent with what I had heard. The alternatives were less comfortable to consider, and I tried to consider them charitably as well, landing eventually on the possibility that Derek had a practice of thinking aloud or rehearsing conversations that had a more fully embodied quality than I would have expected from someone who had been in 11 months of cohabitation, entirely unremarkable in every other way. I did not investigate further. I closed my bedroom door softly and put on headphones, and worked through the afternoon with the specific deliberateness of someone who has decided that some information is better, neither confirmed nor denied. Derek knocked on my door at 6 to ask if I wanted to order food from a place we both liked, and he was the ordinary Derek of 11 unremarkable months, and I said yes, and we ordered food and ate in the living room, watching something on television with the comfortable ease of two people who have shared space long enough to share it without effort. I did not mention the conversation. Not that evening, not in the remaining 3 weeks of the lease, not at any point. We moved out on the last day of the lease, with the warm but unceremonious goodbye of two people who had cohabited successfully and had no particular need to extend the cohabitation. Derek went wherever Derek went. I went to my next apartment. I have told this story many times. Each time I tell it, I get versions of the same questions, which are, did I ever find out what was happening, and do I have a theory? The answer to the first is no. The answer to the second is that I have several theories, and I rotate between them depending on how charitable I am feeling on a given day, and none of them are more supported by the available evidence than the others, and I've come to believe that the unanswered quality of it is the thing I'm going to carry, rather than a resolution I'm going to arrive at. Derek was a good roommate. 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in month 11 is a data point that I cannot integrate, and have decided not to require integration of. Some things that happen in shared apartments are simply the reminder that the people you live with are mostly familiar and occasionally entirely not, and that the occasionally entirely not does not cancel the mostly familiar. It just adds a layer to it that you eventually learn to hold without needing it to resolve. And that's where we'll leave things tonight. The deliberate closing of the bedroom door and the putting on of headphones is the most human response to the incident available. Not investigation, not confrontation, Not even the processing that usually follows a genuinely strange thing, just the practical decision to create a distance between yourself and something that does not have a comfortable explanation, and that is not, in the immediate term, causing you harm. The food order at 6 is the detail that earns the ending. Derek at the door, ordinary and warm. The 11-month Derek fully present and asking about dinner. And the narrator saying yes and sitting on the couch and watching television as though the afternoon had been the afternoon it usually was. Sometimes the people you live with show you something you cannot account for. And the most functional thing available is to decide that not everything that happens in an apartment needs to be fully understood. This one is from someone who moved into an apartment with a roommate who had, by the end of the lease, never once eaten a meal at a normal hour, and whose relationship with time in general had been a source of quiet, ongoing disruption that only fully assembled into a picture in the final weeks. My roommate's name was Petra, and she operated on a schedule that had no discernible relationship to the schedule the rest of the world operates on. I want to be specific about what I mean because irregular schedules are common, and I'm not describing someone who simply kept late hours or woke up after noon. Yeah, Petra's relationship with time was more fundamental than that. It was as though the standard markers that most people use to organize their days had been removed from her operating system entirely and replaced with something internal and private that bore no consistent relationship to the clock. She cooked dinner at 11:30 at night, not occasionally, as a practice. The sounds of meal preparation, which in our apartment were transmitted through a kitchen wall, to my bedroom with moderate fidelity, arrived reliably in the period between 11 and midnight, and sometimes extended to 12:30, when the recipe was ambitious. She was not a quiet cook. She was an enthusiastic cook, bao, which expressed itself in the kitchen as the sounds of a person who is genuinely engaged in what they are doing and has not thought about the acoustic relationship between the kitchen and the adjacent bedroom. At 11:45 on a Wednesday, I raised this in month 2 with the directness I prefer in necessary conversations. Petra received it with the specific quality of someone hearing something that had not previously occurred to them as a consideration. She was not defensive. She was genuinely surprised, which I found both disarming and slightly difficult to fully believe, given that the acoustic relationship was not subtle. She said she would try to be quieter, and she was, for 2 weeks, quieter. The cooking continued at the same hours, but with a dampened quality that suggested she was attending to the volume dimension of the problem while the hour dimension remained unaddressed. The hour dimension was the more significant one, not because the noise was catastrophic. Once she had modulated it, it wasn't, but because the 11:30 cooking was a symptom of a broader schedule that organized itself around her needs in a way that did not account for the shared environment it was operating inside of. She did laundry at 1 in the morning. She had phone calls that happened in the living room at hours that I registered as the distant sound of conversation through 2 doors at 2:15 on a Thursday. She received deliveries. She had many deliveries. The specific volume of someone who had organized significant portions of their life around things arriving at the door. At times that required the building's buzzer to be answered at hours that the building's buzzer was not supposed to be answered, which produced a sound that was, at 8:30 in the morning on a Saturday, the exact pitch and duration of something designed to be impossible to sleep through. Month 4, I had a more comprehensive conversation with Petra rather than addressing individual instances. I told her I had noticed that her schedule operated differently from mine in ways that had ongoing effects on my sleep and my mornings, and I asked whether there was a version of the household arrangement that could account for both of our schedules more explicitly. She listened with the genuine attention she brought to conversations when she was present for them, which she was intermittently, the intermittent presence being its own expression of the broader schedule. What came out of the conversation was something I had not expected. which was that Petra had a medical situation that genuinely disrupted her circadian rhythm in ways she managed through her schedule rather than against it. She had not mentioned this because she had not thought of it as something that required mentioning, which I found both understandable and another instance of the broader pattern of not accounting for the shared environment in her operational decisions. I want to be honest about what the medical context changed in my response to the situation. It changed the moral weight I assigned to it. The late cooking was no longer the behavior of someone inconsiderate of others, but the behavior of someone managing a genuine constraint and not yet fully accounting for the people adjacent to that management. It did not change the practical impact on my sleep, which remained real regardless of the cause. What I had was a situation I understood more charitably and still needed to find a way to live inside of. We arrived, through several more conversations, at a set of accommodations that were imperfect and functional. She moved the most disruptive cooking to earlier in the evening on the nights when her schedule permitted it. I got better earplugs and a white noise machine and adjusted my expectations about Saturday mornings. The laundry moved to hours that were still late by most standards and acceptable by the adjusted ones. The buzzer situation was addressed by having her deliveries held at a nearby location for weekday pickup, which she organized without complaint once the impact of the Saturday buzzer had been explained to her specifically. The lease ended, and Petra sent me a message after we moved out that was thoughtful and specific about what she had appreciated about the year and what she was sorry she had not figured out earlier. I wrote back something equally honest. The year had been genuinely difficult in the specific sleep-related ways and had also produced something I had not expected, which was a fairly comprehensive education in the difference between someone inconsiderate and someone unaware, and in the very different responses each requires. The responses are not the same. One requires a boundary, the other requires information. Getting them confused is the most common error in difficult living situations, and also one of the more costly ones. That's where that one lands. The medical context arriving mid-story is a structural move that reframes everything before it without excusing it. Not making the disruption acceptable, but making its cause legible in a way that changes what the response should be. The distinction between inconsiderate and unaware is the most practically useful thing this story has to offer, because it is the distinction that determines what will actually work as a response. And most people in difficult living situations never think to make it. In Petra's post-move message being specific rather than generic is the detail that confirms the reframe was accurate. An inconsiderate person does not send that message. An unaware person who has been given information and time does. The next story is from someone who lived with a roommate for 13 months and discovered on the last day that the roommate had been conducting an ongoing and detailed written record of the narrator's behavior in the apartment, which the roommate then attempted to use as documentation for a security deposit dispute that did not go the way they had planned. My roommate's name was Clarence, and he was the kind of person who communicated primarily through written messages, even when we were both in the apartment, and which I had taken in the first months as a personality trait, and which I now understand was methodology. If I left a dish in the sink, he sent a message about the dish. If I had a guest stay over, he sent a message noting the guest's presence and the duration of the stay. If I adjusted the thermostat, he sent a message referencing the adjustment and asking me to confirm I had made it. Each message was polite and specific, and I received them as the communication style of someone who preferred written clarity over verbal ambiguity, which is a legitimate preference. The messages had a quality I noticed without examining. They were documentary rather than conversational. A conversational message about a dish in the sink says something like, "Hey, can you grab that dish when you get a chance?" A documentary message about a dish in the sink records the date, the approximate time, and the item, and confirms receipt of the message through a response. The messages Clarence sent were consistently the second type, and I consistently provided the receipt confirmation because it seemed easier than understanding why the distinction mattered. The security deposit situation arose when we moved out. The landlord inspected the apartment and found it in the condition expected after 13 months of two-person occupancy. Some normal wear, nothing beyond what the lease described as standard, and nothing that warranted a deduction beyond a modest professional cleaning fee. Clarence and I received a communication from the landlord, indicating the deposit would be returned minus the cleaning fee, split evenly, which was the expected outcome. Dad Clarence disputed this. Not the cleaning fee, the split. He sent the landlord a document. I did not see the document until the landlord forwarded it to me for response, at which point I read it with the specific quality of someone encountering something they had not known existed and whose existence reorganized the previous 13 months considerably. The document was a log, 13 months of entries, dated and time-stamped, recording incidents in the apartment that Clarence had categorized as primarily attributable to my occupancy. The dish was in there. The guest stays were in there. The thermostat adjustments were in there. There were entries I did not recognize, and entries I recognized, and entries that were accurate descriptions of things I had done, and entries that were accurate descriptions of things, in a framing that was less neutral than the word accurate might suggest. The log was thorough. It had been assembled with care over 13 months, and it was being deployed in support of a claim that my occupancy had caused disproportionate wear, and therefore the cleaning fee should be allocated disproportionately in Clarence's favor. I read the log twice, and then I sent Clarence a message through the communication channel he preferred, maintaining the methodology, asking him to confirm that the document he had sent the landlord was a log he had been keeping throughout our tenancy. He confirmed this. I asked him why he had been keeping it. He said he believed in documentation and had found it useful in previous living situations. I asked him why he had not told me he was keeping it. He said he had not believed disclosure was required. I responded to the landlord's request for comment with a reply that was specific and documented in its own way. I had the messages Clarence had sent throughout the tenancy, which were time-stamped and had my responses to them, and the messages showed that each incident he had raised had been acknowledged and addressed at the time it occurred. I noted that the lease's standard wear provisions covered the items in the log, and that the log did not demonstrate anything beyond the ordinary occupancy it was describing. I attached the relevant lease language. I kept the response to 3 paragraphs. The landlord returned the deposit with the original split. The cleaning fee was divided evenly. Clarence sent me a message after the landlord's decision. That was 3 sentences of what I understood was intended as a gracious acknowledgement that the dispute had not resolved in his favor. I sent back 2 sentences of acknowledgement and moved on. What I have thought about since is the 13 months of messages and what they were for in the moment I was receiving them, rather than in retrospect. In the moment I received them as the communication style of a particular person. In retrospect, they were a paper trail being assembled in real time. Both things were simultaneously true across 13 months of ordinary shared living, which is the specific quality of the situation that I find most worth sitting with. Clarence had been building something the entire time we had been building what I thought was an ordinary roommate situation, and the building had been invisible to me because I had been reading the messages as communication rather than as documentation. I save my messages now. Not in the documentary way Clarence saved his. Not with the intention of deployment. I save them in the way of someone who has learned that the written record of a living situation is always being assembled whether you participate in it or not, and that it is better to have it than to discover in month 13 that the only version of it available is someone else's. And that's that. The messages, as documentation rather than communication, is the reframe that changes everything. The same texts read entirely differently, depending on which function they are serving, and Clarence had been serving both simultaneously in a way that made the communication reading feel accurate until the documentation purpose was revealed. The narrator's 3-paragraph response to the landlord, structured and sourced and attached to the relevant lease language, is the countermeasure that works precisely because Clarence's methodology had trained them to respond in writing and to acknowledge things specifically, which meant the paper trail he had built was matched by a paper trail that told the same story differently. Drishe. Sometimes the most useful thing a difficult roommate teaches you is not how to avoid difficulty, but how to document your way through it. Here's one from someone who spent 8 months in an apartment with a roommate who had a boyfriend. The narrator never met, never saw, and eventually began to doubt existed, until month 7 when the boyfriend's existence was confirmed in the most unexpected possible way. My roommate's name was Isla, and she talked about her boyfriend, whose name was Scott, with the frequency and specificity of someone who had a significant person in their life. She mentioned Scott in the way that people mention partners, in passing, as context, as the explanation for her weekend plans and her occasional good moods and her less occasional stress ones. Scott had opinions about things, and Scott had a job that required travel. Scott was close with his family in a way that produced periodic commitments. Scott was, from everything Isla described, a fully realized and present person in her life. I never encountered Scott, not once across 8 months. He did not come to the apartment, or if he did, he came at times when I was reliably not there in a way that would have required either coincidence of unusual precision or planning. He was not referenced in any physical evidence. No belongings left behind. No evidence of a second person in the bathroom. None of the specific artifacts that a regularly visiting partner tends to leave in an apartment they visit regularly. He existed entirely in Isla's conversation. I want to be clear that I did not suspect Isla of fabrication in any sinister sense. The more available explanation was that she was simply private about her relationship in a way that kept it out of the shared apartment space, which is a legitimate choice. The absence of physical evidence was explainable by the absence of visits, which was explainable by Scott's travel schedule and their apparent preference for spending time at his place rather than hers. None of it required a dramatic explanation. I did not have a dramatic explanation. I had a mild and increasing curiosity that I filed under none of my business. Month 6, the curiosity had reached a level that I found slightly embarrassing in myself. I'd started to notice when Scott was mentioned and to track internally whether the mentions had internal consistency. Whether the Scott of week 20 was the same Scott as the Scott of week 4. In his described attributes, his job, his family situation, he was consistent. The consistency was reassuring, and also I noticed the consistency of either a real person or someone who had been constructed carefully enough to be consistent. I did not investigate, and I did not ask Isla directly, because asking Isla directly would have required explaining why I was asking, which would have required admitting the mild 8-month preoccupation I had developed about her boyfriend's existence. This felt disproportionate to the actual stakes of the situation, which were essentially zero. Whether Scott existed or not had no practical impact on my life in the apartment. Month 7 resolved the question without my participation. I came home on a Thursday evening, and there was a man in the kitchen. Not an intruder. A man standing at the counter with the comfortable ease of someone who had been in a kitchen before and was oriented to it, making tea in the specific, unhurried way of someone who knows where things are. He looked up when I came in and said he was Scott and he had heard a lot about me and offered to make me tea as well. I said yes to the tea. We talked for 20 minutes while Isla was in the shower, and he was exactly the Scott that the 8 months of descriptions had suggested. The job, the family, the travel, the opinions about things, all present and consistent with the described version. He was, to use the word precisely, real. Isla came out of the shower, and the three of us talked until Scott and Isla left for dinner. When the door closed, I stood in the kitchen for a moment and drank the rest of my tea and experienced the specific quality of someone who has been carrying a mild preoccupation for 8 months and has had it resolved simply and completely in 20 minutes by a man making tea on a Thursday. I have told this story fewer times than most of the others I have told from that period of my life, because the resolution makes it unsatisfying in the conventional sense. There is no reveal, no discovery, no moment where something turns out to be different from what it seemed. Scott existed. Isla had a boyfriend. The 8 months of mild curiosity resolved into a Thursday evening cup of tea and a 20-minute conversation. What makes it worth telling is not the resolution, but the 8 months before it. The specific quality of living adjacent to a relationship that existed entirely in language, and the mild and slightly embarrassing preoccupation that the language-only existence produced in someone who had too much time to think about their roommate's life. There it is. The consistency check the narrator runs on Scott across the months, tracking whether the week 20 Scott matches the week 4. Scott, sammanhängande, is the move that names the preoccupation precisely without requiring the narrator to fully acknowledge its depth, which is the kind of self-aware self-examination that makes a narrator likable. The man making tea on a Thursday is the resolution the story earned through 8 months of building, and its absolute ordinariness is what makes it the right ending. Not a mystery solved, not a fabrication revealed, just a person in a kitchen offering tea, consistent in every particular with the described version, fully and simply real. Sometimes the most interesting thing about a living situation is the question you were carrying that turned out not to need answering. Last one for tonight, someone who moved into what appeared to be a completely standard apartment share and discovered 3 months and that their roommate had an arrangement with the building that neither of them were supposed to know about, and that changed the financial architecture of the situation entirely. My roommate's name was Cora, and she had lived in the apartment for 4 years before I arrived to take the second bedroom. 4 years in the same apartment is long enough to have developed a relationship with the building and its management that a new arrival would not have, and that Cora had not seen fit to describe at the roommate selection stage. I did not know to ask about this relationship because the existence of this kind of relationship was not something I had encountered before, and therefore not something I thought to include in my due diligence. The apartment was rent stabilized. I knew this from the listing, which had described it as a desirable feature, which it is. What I did not know was that rent-stabilized apartments in our building had been the subject of an informal arrangement between long-term tenants and the building management, and in which tenants who had occupied their apartments for more than 3 years were permitted to list a second bedroom at a rate above the stabilized rate, provided that the differential, the gap between the stabilized rent and the market rate second bedroom, was split between the tenant and the building management in a proportion that I will describe as not publicly advertised. What this meant in practice was that my rent, the amount I paid Cora monthly, was above the rate that the stabilized lease would have permitted if the second bedroom had been rented directly by the building, and the above stabilized portion was being divided between Cora and the building in a proportion that I was funding without knowing I was funding it. I found this out from a neighbor, not through any investigation. Through a conversation in the elevator in month 3 that turned out to contain more information than either of us had expected. The neighbor had been in the building longer than Cora and had the specific familiarity with the building's informal architecture that long-term residents develop. She mentioned the arrangement in a passing way that assumed I knew about it, which I did not, and by the time the elevator reached my floor, I had the outline of something I needed to look into. I looked into it. The stabilized rate for the apartment was publicly accessible through a city housing database that I had not known existed until month 3 of living in a rent-stabilized apartment. The rate I was paying was above the stabilized rate by a specific amount that, multiplied by 3 months, I represented money I had paid toward an arrangement I had not been told about and had not agreed to. I had a conversation with Cora that was the most financially specific conversation I had ever had with a roommate. I told her what I had found and what it indicated about the structure of my rent. And I asked her to explain the arrangement to me in her own words, so that I was working from her version rather than my reconstruction of it. She was honest to her credit. She did not attempt to deny the arrangement or construct an alternative version of it. She said the arrangement was what I had described and that she had not told me because she had not thought of it as something that affected me in a way I needed to know about. I told her that paying above the stabilized rate for a stabilized apartment, without knowing I was doing so, was something that affected me in a way I needed to know about. She said she understood and that she should have told me. I said yes, and then I told her what I thought was a fair recalibration of my going forward rent based on the stabilized rate, and I said I thought the retroactive difference for the 3 months was something she should return to me, given that it had been collected under circumstances I had not consented to. The conversation that followed was long and produced a negotiated outcome, rather than the clean resolution I had initially requested. She returned a portion of the 3-month differential, not the full amount, but enough that the negotiation concluded with something other than one party fully absorbing the arrangement's cost. My going forward rent was adjusted to a rate that was below my original rent and above the strictly stabilized rate, which was not the strictly correct outcome, but was the practical one available, given the complexity of the arrangement and the lease we were both party to. I moved out when the lease renewed rather than signing another term. Not primarily because of the financial arrangement. The recalibrated rent was manageable, but because the arrangement had revealed something about Cora's approach to shared information that I did not feel I had fully mapped, and I did not know what else the 4 years of building familiarity had produced that I had not yet found in the elevator. The building, when I moved out, had a new tenant in my former bedroom within 2 weeks. I have sometimes thought about that tenant and whether anyone mentioned the stabilized rate to them before they signed, and I've concluded that the answer is probably the same answer I received, which is to say, I have concluded nothing, which is its own kind of answer. And that's where we'll leave things tonight. The elevator conversation that contains more information than either party expected is one of the great mechanisms of urban living. The accidental disclosure that happens when two people assume a shared context that only one of them actually has. Cora's honesty when confronted is the thing that allows the situation to resolve it all. And her framing that she had not thought of the arrangement as something that affected the narrator in a way they needed to know about is the framing of someone who had decided at some point that their own financial arrangement was a private matter rather than a shared living disclosure, which it is and is not simultaneously. The neighbor in the elevator is the hero of the whole story, sharing information in passing that changed the financial picture of someone's living situation, almost certainly without knowing she had done it. This one is from someone who shared an apartment for 10 months with a person who had a single household rule that they enforced with a consistency and creativity that eventually became the defining experience of the entire lease. My roommate's name was Theo, and his rule was about the front door, specifically about locking the front door. Not just locking it in a particular sequence that he had determined was the only sequence that fully engaged all 3 of the door's locking mechanisms simultaneously, which he believed was the only configuration that constituted the door actually being locked as opposed to the door appearing to be locked. The sequence involved the deadbolt, the handle lock, and a chain that most people in the apartment used only when they were home, and which Theo used as a permanent fixture of the locking configuration, regardless of whether anyone was home to use the chain from the inside, which was not how chains on doors are designed to function, which Theo was aware of, and which had led him to install a specific aftermarket chain mechanism that could be engaged from the outside with a small tool he kept on his keychain. I want to let the aftermarket chain mechanism sit for a moment before I continue. He had installed it himself in the first week he had lived in the apartment, before I arrived. He had gotten landlord approval through a conversation he described as straightforward, which I believe because the landlord was the kind of person who approved things without examining them closely, and who would have heard aftermarket security hardware and concluded this was a low-risk modification. The mechanism worked. The door, when locked with Theo's full sequence using the small tool on his keychain, was comprehensively secured in a way that standard locking would not have achieved. And this was genuinely not nothing. The building was in a neighborhood that had experienced a burglary in the adjacent unit 8 months before I moved in, and Theo's security consciousness was not irrational. What made it a living situation rather than simply a locked door was the way Theo's security consciousness extended to my participation in it. He had explained the locking sequence on the day I moved in, with the thoroughness of a safety briefing, which I had received as thorough, and then not fully retained because I had been moving furniture and managing the 1,000 other things that move-in day produces. The incomplete retention turned out to matter, because Theo was attentive to the door in a way that meant he knew, when he arrived home after me, whether the full sequence had been engaged or whether only a subset of the sequence had been engaged. He could tell from the resistance of the handle whether the deadbolt had been engaged in the correct order, relative to the handle lock. He could tell from the specific give of the door whether the aftermarket chain mechanism had been used, or whether I had relied on the standard locks and assumed the chain mechanism was a when I'm home only option. I received, in the first month, 11 messages about the door. Each message was polite and specific, and referenced the particular element of the locking sequence I had failed to complete correctly. I improved across the month. The messages went from daily to every other day to twice weekly by the end of month 1, which I experienced as progress, and which Theo acknowledged as progress in a message that was itself encouraging. By month 2, I had achieved a reasonable competence with the full sequence, and the messages had reduced to 1 or 2 a week, which were occasioned by the specific circumstances that produced door locking errors. When I was running late, when I was distracted, when I was carrying things, when it was raining. Month 4, I made an error that I want to describe specifically, because it produced Theo's most creative response to an incomplete locking sequence. I had come home late and tired and had engaged the deadbolt and the handle lock, and had genuinely intended to complete the sequence with the aftermarket chain mechanism, and had simply forgotten. When Theo arrived home after me, he found the door in the 2/3 engaged state and sent me a message that was different in character from the previous door messages. It was longer. It had a considered quality that suggested it had been composed with care, rather than sent in the immediate aftermath of the discovery. It contained a metaphor about doors and the relationship between partial commitment and genuine security. That was, I want to say plainly, a better metaphor than the situation required. It concluded with a request that I consider the chain mechanism not as an additional step, but as the final confirmation of an intention that the other 2 steps had prepared for, which was either profound or the most elaborate response to a door chain that has ever been sent as a text message. I read it 3 times, and then I got up and went to the door and engaged the chain mechanism, and came back and sat down and sent him a message saying it was done, and that I had found the metaphor useful. The situation did not resolve entirely across the 10 months. There were always the late night and distracted occasions when the sequence was incomplete. What resolved was my understanding of Theo, which shifted from baffled to something more specific. He was a person for whom the door was a site of genuine anxiety that he had addressed through the most thorough available means. And the thoroughness was the management strategy rather than an expression of rigidity. The metaphor in the month 4 message was the tell. You do not write a metaphor about door chains as a hostile act. You write it because the thing genuinely matters to you, and you're trying to communicate the mattering in a way that lands. I found that once I understood what the door was for Theo, the locking sequence became easier to maintain, not because the sequence had changed, but because I was doing it for a reason I understood, rather than a requirement I was managing. That's where that one lands. The aftermarket chain mechanism installed before the narrator arrived is the detail that establishes Theo as a person who had thought about this before there was anyone to think about it with, which changes the character of the door rule from an imposition on a roommate to a pre-existing practice that the roommate was asked to participate in. The month 4 metaphor is the story's centerpiece, not because of what it says about the chain, but because of what it reveals about Theo, which is that the door is the location of something real, rather than a staging ground for control. The sequence becoming easier to maintain once its purpose is understood is the resolution that this story earns, which is quieter than most resolutions and more durable. This next one comes from someone who lived with a roommate for a year and discovered in month 11 that the entire apartment had been the subject of a social media account they had never been told about. My roommate's name was B, and she was warm and present and easy to live with in the ways that matter most in shared housing. She communicated well. She managed her share of the practical dimensions without requiring follow-up. She had friends who came over occasionally and who were uniformly pleasant. I liked B. I told people I liked her. The year was a good year in the apartment, and I held it as such. Month 11, I was at a work event, and a colleague who knew where I lived mentioned, in a way that assumed I knew, that she followed the apartment's account. I said something non-committal while processing what an account associated with our apartment would be. And when I got home, I searched the platforms I used and found it on one of them within 3 minutes. The account had been running for 8 months. It was presented as a lifestyle and interior account, the aesthetic of our apartment, which was genuinely good because B had an eye for it and had arranged the common spaces with a care that translated well to photographs, was the consistent subject. The account had developed a following of several thousand people who responded to the photographs with the specific enthusiasm of people who relate to a well-curated domestic space. The photographs were beautiful. Our apartment was beautiful in them. I was in several of them. Not prominently, I want to be accurate about the degree of my appearance in the account, which was peripheral. A hand at the edge of a photograph, a jacket on a hook that I recognized as mine, once a partial profile in a kitchen photograph. That was clearly me, and that several hundred people had apparently looked at as part of appreciating the light quality of our kitchen on a Tuesday morning. The comments on the kitchen photograph said things about the light. Nobody commented on the partial profile. I was ambient rather than featured. I asked B about the account when I got home. She was in the living room, and I sat down with my phone showing her the account page and asked her to tell me about it. She had the expression of someone who had considered the possibility of this conversation and had hoped it would not arrive before the lease ended, which was a month away. She said she had started it as a personal project, and it had grown beyond what she had expected, and she had not known how to bring it up once it had grown. I asked her several specific questions, whether she had considered asking me before starting it, given that the apartment was shared and I was occasionally in it when photographs were taken. She said she had not initially thought of it as something requiring my permission because the photographs were of the apartment, rather than of me. I said the apartment was mine as much as it was hers, and that my presence in it, even peripheral, was mine to consent to sharing. She acknowledged this and said she should have asked. I asked whether the account was monetized. She said it had recently begun receiving small payments from one brand partnership. I asked whether the partnership had involved photographs that included the shared space. She said yes. I sat with that for a moment. We arrived at a conversation about what to do with the situation. I did not ask her to take down the account. which would have been disproportionate and also practically complicated given the audience it had developed. I asked her to remove photographs that included me in any form, which she agreed to and did. I asked whether future photographs would be taken with my awareness, and she agreed to this as well. I noted that the monetization created a dimension to the shared space question that warranted acknowledgement, and we had a shorter and less comfortable conversation about that dimension that concluded with an agreement I found acceptable without being fully satisfied by it. The lease ended a month later, and we moved out with the warmth the year had genuinely produced, complicated by the month 11 discovery in a way that neither of us tried to resolve completely. The account continues. I know this because I have checked it occasionally in the months since, in the way of someone who knows they should stop checking and has not fully stopped. The apartment has a new tenant now, whose presence in the photographs is, from what I can see, equally ambient and equally unannounced. And I have thought several times about sending that person a message and have not sent it. And I am still deciding whether the not sending is the right call. There it is. B's framing that the photographs were of the apartment rather than of me is the distinction that does the work she needs it to do, while not actually resolving the question it is supposed to resolve, because the apartment is not separable from the people who live in it in the way that framing requires. The partial profile in the kitchen photograph that several hundred people looked at as part of appreciating the light quality is the detail that makes the abstract violation concrete. Not a violation in any dramatic sense, just a person's image circulating in a context they had not agreed to, in a way that most of those several hundred people would not think twice about, which is the specific character of the harm. The thought about messaging the new tenant and the not sending of the message is the right ending image. The unresolved question of what you owe a stranger who is living the situation you lived, and the uncertainty about whether the owing extends to the action. This one is from someone who spent 6 months in an apartment with a person who was, in every observable way, a model roommate, and whose model roommate behavior turned out to have a specific and previously undisclosed motivation. My roommate's name was Sam, and he was 26 and had moved to the city 8 months before I did, and had been living in the apartment alone, before adding a roommate to offset costs. And the apartment had been his for a year before I arrived, and it showed in the way that spaces show the personality of the person who has lived in them alone. The arrangement of things had a logic that was specifically his, and that I was fitting myself into, rather than contributing to, which was fine because the logic was good and the fitting was easy. He was a considerate roommate, with the specific completeness of someone who had thought about what considerate looked like and was executing on the thinking. He replaced things before they ran out. He cleaned the kitchen after using it in a way that left it better than he found it. He was quiet in the mornings and had told me his schedule so that I could calibrate mine around it. He communicated about things that affected the shared space with a promptness that I found, in the first months, slightly above the baseline I'd come to expect from roommates, and attributed to his having lived alone, and developed habits without someone else to defer to. Month 5. I had a friend visit for a long weekend, and my friend, who had stayed with me in previous apartments and had a point of comparison, mentioned that Sam seemed like he was trying very hard. I asked what she meant. She said the trying quality was difficult to describe specifically, but that it had a slight performance dimension. The consideration felt slightly conscious, in a way that organic consideration usually did not. I said I had not noticed this, and she said it was possible she was wrong, and we moved on. Month 6, I found out what Sam was doing, which reframed my friend's observation with a precision that I found both illuminating and slightly disorienting. He was writing about it. Not a journal, a newsletter. He had a small newsletter, several hundred subscribers, about intentional living and the practice of shared domestic space. and our apartment was the material he had been drawing on for the 6 months of our cohabitation. Not with my name. He used a descriptor, my roommate, consistently, but with a specificity that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone who knew me. He had not told me about the newsletter before we moved in together. He had not told me during the 6 months. I found out because a friend of a friend subscribed to it and recognized the apartment from a detail Sam had included and mentioned it to the mutual friend who mentioned it to me. I read the archive, all of it, and the entries about our apartment were observational rather than critical. He wrote about shared living as a practice with a genuine thoughtfulness, and the entries that involved me were not unflattering, which I noted and which did not resolve the primary issue. The primary issue was not the content, it was the consent. He had been writing about our shared life for 6 months and turning it into public material without telling me he was doing so. I told him what I had found. He received it with the specific quality of someone who had known this conversation was possible and had told himself it was unlikely. He said he had not thought of the newsletter as something that required disclosure because he used no identifying information. I said the identifying information argument was the same argument I had heard from Bita in a previous apartment, and it had not resolved the question there either, and that the apartment was mine as much as his, and my life in it was mine, regardless of whether my name was attached to the public version. He said he understood and he was sorry, and he asked what I wanted him to do. I said I wanted him to tell me, going forward, if he was writing about shared life in a way that included material from our apartment. He agreed, and he did. For the remaining months of the lease, he flagged entries that included apartment material and sent them to me before publishing, which was the version of the arrangement that I could live inside. He also, without being asked, went back through the archive and removed the entries that were most specifically identifiable, which I found to be a more complete acknowledgement of the original problem than I had expected. I renewed the lease for another term. The second year was better than the first in the ways that honesty makes things better. Clearer, more mutual, with the specific ease that comes from two people who have had the necessary difficult conversation and come out the other side of it, still willing to share a kitchen. The newsletter continued, and I occasionally read it and occasionally recognized things in it and had this strange experience of seeing my life refracted through someone else's thoughtful attention, which was uncomfortable in a way I have not fully resolved, and interesting in a way I also have not fully resolved. And that's that. Like Sam's newsletter being thoughtful rather than critical is the detail that makes the consent question harder rather than easier. It would be simpler if the material were unflattering, because then the harm would be legible, without the complication of the content being genuinely good. The consent question existing independently of the content's quality is the thing the narrator names correctly, and Sam's response, going back through the archive unprompted, is what earns the lease renewal. The strange experience of recognizing your life in someone else's thoughtful attention is the right ending note. Uncomfortable and interesting simultaneously, neither fully resolved, which is the honest version of what that experience actually is. This one comes from someone who had a roommate for 14 months and learned at the very end that the 14 months had included a parallel living situation they had shared without knowing they were sharing it. My roommate's name was Elena, and she was a graduate student when we moved in together, which meant her schedule had the specific variability of someone whose work happened in bursts rather than on a fixed calendar. She was sometimes home for days at a stretch, and sometimes gone for days at a stretch. And the variability had seemed, in the early months, to be a function of the academic cycle. Deadlines produced absence, recovery produced presence. I calibrated my expectations around the variability without examining it closely, because the explanation was available, and the calibration was easy. And the parallel living situation was her mother, who lived 3 hours away, and who, I discovered in month 13, had been staying in the apartment during the stretches when Elena was gone. Not occasionally, regularly. Elena would leave for a conference or a research trip or an extended library period, and her mother, who had a key that I had not known existed, would come and stay in Elena's bedroom for the duration of the absence. The mother was apparently very quiet and very clean and very careful to leave no evidence of her stays, which she had been doing for approximately 10 months before I found out. I found out because I came home unexpectedly in the middle of a day when Elena was away and found her mother in the kitchen making tea. The mother was not alarmed by my arrival. She introduced herself with the ease of someone who had been in the apartment before and was comfortable in it, which was because she had been in the apartment before and was comfortable in it. She offered me tea. I accepted the tea while my understanding of the previous 10 months reorganized itself. Elena's mother was a lovely person. I want to say this clearly because it is relevant to how the story resolved and because it is true. She was warm and sharp and interested in things, and the 40 minutes we spent in the kitchen before she offered to leave were 40 minutes I found genuinely enjoyable. She said Elena had spoken well of me. I said Elena had not mentioned her, which I delivered with the measured quality of someone who is communicating something while maintaining plausible conversational neutrality. I called Elena after her mother left. Elena answered, and I could hear in the first second of the call that she had already received a message from her mother about the encounter. I said I had met her mother and that she was lovely and that I had some questions about the arrangement. Elena said she had been meaning to tell me about her mother's visits and had not found the right moment across the 10 months that they had been occurring. I said I was familiar with the not finding the right moment pattern and that I understood it and also that I wanted to talk about it. The conversation that followed was honest and produced more context than I had expected. Elena's mother had been going through a difficult period, a health situation that had been ongoing and that had made Elena unwilling to leave her mother alone at home for extended periods, but also unwilling to cancel the professional obligations that required her travel. The apartment had become the solution because it was between the two locations and because Elena's key had always existed for emergency purposes and had been quietly repurposed. Elena had not told me because she had not known how to ask permission for something she had already started doing, which is the specific difficulty of a situation that has proceeded past the point where asking would have been simple. I told her I understood the difficulty and that I wished she had found the asking harder and done it anyway, because the 10 months of not asking had produced a situation where someone had been staying in our apartment without my knowledge, and my consent had been managed around rather than sought. So I said the mother was welcome to continue staying if the need continued. And I meant this. The mother was genuinely lovely, and her situation was genuinely hard. But that I wanted to know when she was there. Elena said she would tell me. She did for the remaining months of the lease. And the mother's subsequent visits were ones I was aware of, and occasionally intersected with in ways I found unexpectedly pleasant. The situation was a violation of the apartment's terms, and also the resolution of it was one of the better things that came out of the 14 months, which is the specific complicated quality that this story has that most of the others in tonight's collection do not. The harm was real. The context was real. The mother was real and lovely, and her visits, once known about, were a different thing than they had been when they were unknown. Not all violations of a shared living arrangement produce simple conclusions about what should have happened and what the relationship should be afterward. And this one does not produce a simple conclusion, and I've decided not to require one. There it is. Elena's mother being lovely is not a resolution to the consent question, and the narrator does not treat it as one. The loveliness is real, and the violation is real, and the story holds both, without letting either cancel the other. The specific difficulty of asking permission for something you have already started doing is named precisely because it is the thing that produced the 10 months of silence. Not malice, not indifference, but the practical impossibility of asking for something, once the asking would require confessing the duration of the not asking. The resolution being one of the better things from the 14 months. Is the honest complexity the situation produces, and the decision not to require a simple conclusion is the only place a story with this shape can honestly end. This one is from someone who spent 8 months living with a roommate who was, by every measure, a perfectly reasonable person to share space with, and who had a single habit that was so specific and so inexplicable that it became the organizing memory of the entire lease. My roommate's name was Paul, and he was clean and quiet and financially reliable and present in the apartment in the easy, unobtrusive way that makes shared living feel like the sensible arrangement it is supposed to be. We were friendly without being friends, which is the ideal register for a roommate relationship. When the two people involved have sufficiently separate lives, that the apartment is the only point of intersection. I had no complaints about Paul. I told people I had no complaints about Paul. The 8 months were ordinary in the best possible sense. The habit appeared in month 2, and I noticed it without examining it, and then noticed it again in month 3, and examined it, and then noticed it again in month 4, and accepted it as a permanent feature of the living situation that I was not going to understand. Paul reorganized the furniture in the common areas once a month. Not dramatically, not wholesale rearrangements that required significant physical effort or that produced a fundamentally different spatial experience. Small adjustments. The couch moved 3 inches toward the window. The coffee table rotated slightly clockwise. A lamp that had been in the corner appeared one day against the wall, and several weeks later was back in the corner. The bookshelf, which was heavy, and which the adjustments involved despite the heaviness, shifted along its wall in increments that were individually small, and that over 8 months produced a total displacement of approximately 4 feet from where it had started, at which point it began moving back. I asked Paul about it in month 3. He said he liked to adjust things periodically. I asked whether there was a reason or a system behind the adjustments. He said he found the space easier to be in when things were slightly different than that they had been. I said I had noticed the adjustments were monthly, and he said he supposed that they were. He had not thought about the frequency specifically. I asked if he needed me to do anything about it, or if the adjustments were something he handled himself. He said he handled them himself. I said all right, and that was the extent of the conversation. The adjustments continued across the remaining 6 months, with the regularity I had established in month 3. The bookshelf completed its journey across the wall and began its return. The couch went through approximately 2 full cycles of its 3-inch displacement and return. The lamp settled into a rotation that I eventually understood as a quarterly pattern, nested inside the monthly pattern of the larger adjustments, which I found impressive in a way I could not fully articulate. I adapted to the adjustments in the way that people adapt to things they cannot change, and do not particularly need to change, by building them into the expected texture of the environment, rather than treating each one as an event. When I came home and found the coffee table slightly rotated, I noted it and moved on. When the bookshelf had advanced further along its wall than the previous week, I noted it and moved on. I stopped trying to understand the system because the system was Paul's, and Paul had said he found the space easier to be in when things were slightly different than they had been, which was an explanation I decided to accept at face value rather than examine further. What I have thought about since, in the years between that apartment and now, is not the adjustments themselves, but what they suggested about Paul's relationship to space and the specific way that, slightly different than it had been addressed, something for him that I did not have access to and did not need to have access to. The adjustments were not disruptive, they were not damaging, They cost me nothing except the mild, ongoing curiosity I had developed about the system and its logic, which was not a significant cost. Paul had a thing he did with space, and the thing worked for him and was contained within his role in the apartment in a way that did not require my understanding or my participation. I have had roommates who took things, and roommates who hid things, and roommates who built elaborate systems for other people to navigate, and roommates who were running operations from the living room. Paul moved the furniture in small increments once a month and found the space easier to live in afterward, and kept doing it for 8 months without it causing a single problem that required addressing. He was, I've concluded, the best roommate I ever had. The bookshelf is the proof of this. 4 feet across the wall and 4 feet back, and not one conversation that needed to happen. That's where that one lands. The bookshelf completing its journey across the wall and returning is the image that earns the conclusion the narrator reaches at the end. Not despite the adjustments, but because of what the adjustments represent, which is a person who had a specific relationship to their environment and managed it entirely within their own domain without requiring anything from the person they shared the space with. The conclusion that Paul was the best roommate is counterintuitive, coming at the end of a collection full of more dramatic situations, which is exactly why it is the right conclusion. The best roommate is not necessarily the one who does the most or explains the most or has the most legible habits, but the one whose presence in the apartment cost you nothing you weren't willing to spend. This one is from someone who moved into what they thought was the right apartment with the right roommate at the right time. And spent 12 months learning that all 3 of those assessments had been slightly wrong in ways that added up to something more significant than the sum of the individual parts. Her name was Vivian, and I had known her peripherally for 2 years before we decided to live together, which I had believed was better than living with a stranger, and which produced a different set of complications than living with a stranger would have. With a stranger, you have no prior relationship to protect. With someone you know, even peripherally, the apartment exists inside an existing social architecture, and the things that go wrong in the apartment travel back through that architecture in ways that are harder to contain. The first complication was the apartment itself. I had been more flexible about location than Vivian, and had deferred to her preference for a neighborhood that was better for her commute and less convenient for mine. This was a reasonable compromise at the signing stage and became a daily experience of a commute that was 20 minutes longer than what I had been accustomed to, which is not a large number in isolation, and which across 12 months of 5-day weeks produced something I had not fully calculated at the signing stage. The second complication was the dynamic that the apartment produced between us, which was different from the dynamic our peripheral friendship had produced. Peripheral friendships operate on a schedule of occasional contact that allows both parties to present a managed version of themselves. The version that shows up for the dinner or the event, which is the version that has had time to prepare, and which is not the version that runs out of coffee on a Wednesday and is navigating a difficult work period and has not done the dishes in 3 days. Vivian and I encountered each other's full, unmanaged versions within the first month, and the encounter reorganized our understanding of each other in ways that the peripheral friendship had not prepared either of us for. She was messier than I had expected, not dramatically, not the kind of mess that requires an intervention or produces a conflict. Just the ordinary mess of someone whose relationship to tidiness was different from mine in ways that were below the threshold of confrontation and above the threshold of invisibility. I noticed the mess. I did not raise it for 3 months. When I raised it, I did so carefully, and she received it well and improved modestly, and then returned to her baseline, which is the standard trajectory of this particular conversation in shared living situations, and which I had known from experience and had chosen to have the conversation anyway. I was more particular about noise than she had expected. Not noise from other people, noise from me. I worked from home on Fridays, and on those Fridays, I had requirements about the apartment's acoustic environment that Vivian found more specific than she had anticipated. I was aware these requirements were on the specific end of the spectrum. I communicated them directly, but she accommodated them without complaint and with a quality of effort that I found both appreciated and slightly highlighted. The effort being visible was its own communication about what the accommodation was costing her. We navigated the 12 months with the functional competence of two people who are committed to making something work and who have enough goodwill in the account to absorb the ordinary friction of shared living. Nothing broke significantly. No single incident defined the year. The complications were distributed and modest and cumulative, in the way that modest complications are when they have 12 months to accumulate. What changed at the end of the 12 months was not the apartment situation, which had found its functional equilibrium, but the peripheral friendship, which had been altered in ways that the 12 months had not reversed. We knew each other differently now, more completely, with less of the managed presentation that the peripheral friendship had run on, and the more complete knowledge had changed the friendship's character in ways that neither of us had fully anticipated when we had signed the lease. We did not renew, not because of conflict. We had not had a significant conflict, because we had both understood by month 10 or 11 that the living situation and the friendship were affecting each other in both directions, and that neither was fully recoverable to what it had been while the other continued. We moved out with warmth and a conversation about the year that was more honest than our peripheral friendship would have produced, and less comfortable than a fully intact friendship would have allowed. She and I have dinner occasionally. The dinner version of Vivian is closer to the person I had known peripherally than the apartment version was, which I find both reassuring and slightly melancholy, and the specific way of something that was changed and has partially returned, but not completely. We do not talk about the apartment much. When we do, it is with the rueful humor of two people who tried something and found it more complicated than they had expected, which is the most honest and most functional register available for that particular conversation. There it is. The cumulative weight of modest complications distributed across 12 months is the thing this story is about rather than any single incident, which makes it harder to tell than the stories with a clear central event, and also more recognizable to most people who have lived with someone they knew before the apartment. The peripheral friendship's managed presentation versus the apartment's full, unmanaged version is the exact mechanism of why living with someone you know can be harder than living with a stranger. You have something to lose that the stranger situation does not create. The dinner version of Vivian being closer to the peripheral version is the quietly melancholy detail that ends this one correctly, because it names the thing that was changed without requiring it to be either fully recovered or fully lost. And this one is from someone whose roommate nightmare was the quietest one in tonight's collection, and the one that took the longest to understand, and the one that they have thought about more than any of the louder ones. Her name was Margot, and she was my roommate for 9 months, and I liked her genuinely. And I believe she liked me genuinely, and the 9 months were not unpleasant in any conventional sense. We cooked together occasionally. We watched things together occasionally. We had the kind of conversations that happen between two people who are compatible enough to be easy company, without being similar enough to be close friends. I would have described the living situation, if asked, during those 9 months, as one of the better ones I had experienced. What I understood at the end of the 9 months was something I had been feeling without naming for most of the middle portion of it, from roughly month 3 to month 8, which was a feeling that has taken me some time to find accurate language for. The closest I have come is this: I felt during those months slightly less than I had been when I moved in. Not dramatically, not in a way that produced a specific complaint or specific incident, just a gradual and ambient erosion of some quality in myself, that I could not locate precisely while it was happening. I have thought about Margot and what produced this feeling for long enough that I have arrived at something I believe is accurate, which is that Margot had a way of engaging with the things I said and did that subtracted from them in small increments, not through criticism. She was not critical, not through dismissal. She engaged with everything I brought to a conversation. The subtraction was more specific than either of those. It was the way she received things, a slight recalibration downward of whatever I offered. A story that became, in her reception of it, slightly less interesting than it had been when I started telling it. An achievement that arrived at her end of the conversation at a slightly reduced scale. An idea that emerged from her engagement with it slightly smaller than it had entered. None of these reductions were dramatic. Each was individually deniable. Together they had a direction. I did not name this while I was inside it because naming it would have required me to say something that sounded, in the saying, like an accusation I could not support with specific evidence. I could not point to an incident. I could not quote a thing she had said. The erosion was in the texture of the engagement rather than in any documentable element of it, which made it the hardest kind of thing to address and the kind most likely to make the person addressing it sound like they are describing something that is not there. What I did instead was leave at the end of the 9 months with a more accurate understanding of the feeling I had been carrying, which was that shared living with someone who consistently receives you at a slight reduction is its own particular kind of wearing, distinct from the louder and more documentable kinds of difficult roommate situations, and in some ways harder to recover from, because there is nothing to point to and nothing to address, and the only available response is distance. I have been more attentive since to the direction of engagement and the people I spend significant time with. The question of whether someone receives what you offer at the scale you offered it is not a question I had thought to ask before Margot, and I ask it now in the way of someone who has learned to notice a specific thing by experiencing its absence. I do not ask it with suspicion. Most people receive things at roughly the scale they were offered, and the question resolves quickly. I ask it the way you ask any question that experience has taught you matters, which is attentively and without drama and as early as the information is available. And that's that. The erosion being in the texture of the engagement rather than in any documentable element is the most precisely described harm in tonight's collection. Harder to name than theft or a noise violation or a financial scheme, and more genuinely difficult to recover from, because the absence of a specific incident means there is no resolution available, only distance. The narrator asking the question of whether someone receives what you offer at the scale you offered it is the most useful thing any of tonight's stories leaves behind. Practical, specific, extractable from the situation that produced it, and applicable to every relationship that follows. The final story tonight comes from someone who spent 10 months in an apartment, and navigated every difficulty the situation produced, and arrived at the end of the lease, having learned something about themselves that the apartment had been the only available classroom for. Her name was Rosa, and I moved in with her at a point in my life when I was coming out of a period of living alone. 2 years of a solo apartment that I had needed, and that I had outgrown in the way you outgrow things that were right for a time and are no longer right and have not yet become wrong. I had told myself I was ready for shared living. I believed this. It was partially true. Rosa was a good roommate. I want to establish this as the ground the story stands on, rather than the thing it complicates, because the complications in this story are mine rather than hers. She was considerate and communicative and present in the apartment in the easy, undemanding way that good roommates are present. She had qualities that should have made the living situation simple. She was direct, she was warm, she was reliable in the practical dimensions. And the living situation was not simple because I was bringing something to it that Rose's qualities could not address. What I was bringing was 2 years of solo living habits that had solidified during the 2 years, from preferences into requirements without my noticing the solidification. I liked the kitchen a specific way, not my specific way. A specific way that had become invisible to me as a preference because it had been the only way the kitchen was for 2 years. And invisible preferences are the ones you discover only when someone else's different preferences make them visible. Rosa's kitchen preferences were not wrong. They were hers. They occupied the same space as mine had occupied alone, and the occupation produced a friction I had not anticipated and was slow to name accurately. The bathroom was the same, the timing of shared spaces was the same. The specific ambient qualities of an apartment occupied by one person, the soundscape, the light patterns, the particular way a space settles when it is organized around a single person's rhythms, had been mine for 2 years and were no longer mine. And the no longer mine quality expressed itself in me as a low-level discomfort that I spent the first 4 months attributing to the adjustment period, and the next 4 months being unable to explain as anything other than what it was, which was that I had become someone who was genuinely better suited to living alone than I had been 2 years before, and had not known this about myself when I signed the lease. Rosa noticed before I named it. In month 7, she asked me, with the directness that was one of her better qualities, whether I was happy in the apartment. I said I was fine, she said. She had not asked if I was fine. I thought about the distinction and said I was not unhappy, and that I liked her, and that the apartment was good. She said she believed all of those things, and she also thought something was not quite right, and she was asking directly because she preferred to know, rather than to observe without knowing. I told her what I have just told you. Not all of it, not the 2-year analysis I had arrived at by month 7, because the analysis was still incomplete in month 7. But the part I had access to, which was that I was finding shared living harder than I had expected, and that the difficulty was not about her specifically, and that I was trying to understand it. She received this with the directness and warmth that characterized her at her best. She said she had wondered if something like that was the case. She said living with someone who had lived alone for a significant period could produce a specific kind of friction that was nobody's fault, and that she had experienced a version of it before, from the other direction. She had been the solo liver re-entering shared living once, years earlier, and had found it harder than she had expected. She said it usually got easier around the 8 or 9 month mark in her experience, which turned out to be accurate. The final months of the lease were better than the middle ones, not because anything external changed, but because naming the thing had changed my relationship to it. I was no longer confused about what I was experiencing. I was experiencing something I understood, which is a different and more manageable situation. I adjusted my expectations of myself and of the apartment, and of what the friction meant, and the adjusting produced the ease that Rosa had predicted. I did not renew the lease, not because the final months had not been better, they had, but because the 10 months had told me something accurate about what I needed, and what I needed was a space that was mine, in the specific way that 2 years of solo living had calibrated me to need. And the most honest response to an accurate self-knowledge is to act on it, rather than to test it against another 12 months of evidence. I found a 1-bedroom. Rosa found a new roommate. We are in contact occasionally, and the contact has a warmth that the apartment produced, and that I am glad to have. She was a good roommate who deserved a better version of me than the one she got, and the better version is the one that is currently living alone in a 1-bedroom, with a kitchen organized in the specific way it is organized, and a soundscape that belongs entirely to its single occupant. I do not think I will live with a roommate again. This is not a dramatic conclusion. It is a practical one, arrived at through specific evidence, about what I know of myself, now that I did not know 2 years before I moved in with Rosa. The knowing is worth what it cost. Most things that are actually true about yourself are. That is all of tonight's stories. 32 accounts of shared walls and shared kitchens and shared leases, and all the unexpected things that sharing a space with another person turns out to mean, and the locked doors and the moved furniture and the late night cooking and the notebooks full of timestamps and the camera on the bookshelf and the aftermarket chain mechanism and the conversations that needed to happen and the ones that didn't happen until the moving van arrived. Every single person in tonight's collection signed a lease with some version of the same hope, that the person on the other side of the wall would be reasonable and that the shared space would be a place they could come home to and rest. Some of them got that. Most of them got something more complicated. All of them got something they could not have gotten any other way, which was the specific education of learning to live alongside another person in the particular and unromantic and occasionally maddening reality of what that actually involves. If you have ever stood in a kitchen at 11:30 at night, wondering how you ended up here, or sat in your room with headphones on, managing an ambient implication vocabulary, or received a text about a door chain that contained a better metaphor than the situation required, then tonight's collection was for you. You know how it goes. You got through it. You probably learned something you did not expect to learn. That is, in the end, what apartments full of other people are actually for. Get some rest. I'll see you next time.